Welcome to another thrilling historical western mail-order bride romance audiobook. If you are new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating historical western romance stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. Excited to have you here again. Shall we begin? Act 1. The sun dipped low over the horizon, its dying light turning the dusty camp into a tapestry of amber and rose. The silence of the fading day was punctuated only by the soft, insistent crackle of a small campfire, its warm glow a gentle counterpoint to the encroaching chill. In a modest canvas shelter, Jesse lay on a threadbare cot. His once vibrant eyes now clouded with the quiet sorrow of approaching death. Yet even in his weakened state there burnt within him a fierce, unyielding spark, the resolve of a man who had lived and loved with an honest heart. Cole knelt beside his friend, his weathered hands trembling as they rested on Jesse's calloused wrist. The night air carried the mingled scents of sagebrush and smoke, each breath a reminder of the frontier's harsh beauty and unspoken peril. Jesse's voice, ragged yet resolute, broke the stillness. "Cole," he murmured, each word laced with both pain and an indomitable will, "you must promise me. Promise that you will watch over Leela. She is all I have left. Guard her and her land as you would your own life." His eyes, though dim, shone with a desperate hope that his plea would not fade into the encroaching darkness. Cole's heart clenched with the weight of that request. He met Jesse's gaze steadily, his own eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire and the unspoken determination within. "I swear it, Jesse," he replied, his voice low and trembling with emotion. "I swear upon my very soul that no harm shall befall her or her land while I draw breath." In that moment, beneath the vast burning sky and the solemn chorus of the dying day, an unbreakable vow was forged, one that would come to steer his destiny through the trials and triumphs of the unforgiving West. As the last blush of sunlight yielded to the encroaching night, Cole lingered a moment longer by his friend's side. The embers of the campfire danced like tiny beacons against the deepening twilight, mirroring the fervor of his promise. With a final, lingering look at Jesse, a look that spoke of gratitude, sorrow, and a steadfast commitment, Cole rose from the cot. The weight of his oath pressed upon him as he stepped away from the dim shelter, the solemn promise echoing in his mind as resolutely as the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. Under the vast, star-strewn sky of the frontier, Cole rode away, his silhouette merging with the night. Every step carried the unyielding vow of a man who had seen death's embrace and emerged with a purpose renewed, a promise that would forever shape his journey, as enduring and relentless as the open plains he called home. The first rays of dawn stretched over the endless horizon, spilling golden light across the sprawling ranch. The air was cool, kissed by the last remnants of the night's chill, and yet the promise of warmth lingered, heralding the start of another day. In the distance, the soft sound of cattle lowing blended with the rhythmic creak of weathered windmills, their blades turning lazily in the gentle breeze. A vastness seemed to stretch before Cole McAllister, a quiet, rugged beauty that mirrored the untamed spirit of the land he had sworn to protect. As his horse's hooves stirred the dust on the familiar trail leading to the ranch, Cole's thoughts shifted from the solemn vow he had made the night before to the reality of the promise now set before him. The ranch had once been full of life and laughter. He could still see Jesse's wide grin in his mind's eye, hear the rough baritone voice that had always echoed over the land. But now, with the absence of his best friend, the place felt quieter, more isolated. Only the flicker of the rising sun seemed to breathe life into the landscape, casting long shadows that stretched across the ranch like an ancient, comforting blanket. Cole slowed his horse as he approached the main house, the silhouette of the structure just barely visible against the shifting light of the early morning. He could see the faint outlines of the outbuildings, the barn, the corral, standing firm against the relentless passage of time. The The sounds of the ranch were soothing, the creak of a barn door opening, the thud of a gate closing. Each sound filled him with a sense of belonging, as if he were part of something that had stood the test of time and nature's wrath. But it was also a reminder that Leela, Jesse's widow, was now the one who kept the wheels of the ranch turning. It wasn't long before he saw her. She stood in the early morning light, her back straight, shoulders squared with a quiet resilience that spoke to the weight of her responsibilities. Her long chestnut hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and she wore a faded blue dress with a well-worn apron tied at her waist. Her hands were busy pushing a stubborn wheelbarrow across the uneven ground, but it was her presence, her air of purposeful grace, that caught Cole's attention. Lila didn't look up when he approached, the only sign of awareness being the faintest tightening of her jaw. She had heard his arrival, and though she made no outward sign of it, she was aware of his every move. After a long moment she stopped her task, and her gaze finally met his. The quiet tension between them was palpable, a strange mixture of mutual respect and the ghosts of unspoken emotions. The promise that had been made the night before hung in the air like a fragile thread, binding them together in a way neither could yet comprehend. Her gaze, though steady, held something deeper, a mix of sorrow and strength. Jesse's absence was felt between them, and yet, in that moment, there was something else too, a recognition of the new roles they would have to play for one another, a connection forged in the shared weight of their respective burdens. "Morning," Cole said, his voice gruff but gentle. He dismounted, brushing the dust from his coat as he took in the sight of the land, the rolling hills, the sturdy fences, and the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. Lila's expression softened slightly, her eyes tracing the outline of the ranch, as if she too were seeing it anew. "Morning," she replied quietly, her voice carrying the same resilience that had defined her since the day Jesse had died. There was no need for pleasantries, no false words. They both knew the weight of the world they carried, the responsibilities, the grief, the fragile threads of hope that still clung to the edges of their lives. "I've been meaning to fix that broken fence over by the west pasture," Cole said, his gaze flicking toward the distant section of the ranch. "Would you like some help with it?" Her brow furrowed slightly, as though considering the offer. There was a flicker of something. Wariness, perhaps, but also a sense of gratitude, quickly masked by her usual composure. Leela was not a woman to ask for help, but there was something about Cole, something about the sincerity in his eyes, that made her want to accept. "I think I can manage," she said, though there was a softness to her tone now, a recognition of the shared burden between them. "But I wouldn't turn away the company." Cole nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. There was no room for anything more between them. Not yet. Not when the land and the weight of promises demanded so much from both of them. As they made their way toward the broken fence, the world seemed to breathe around them, the gentle hum of nature accompanying the soft sounds of their boots on the earth. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its golden rays bathing the land in light, casting long shadows that gradually grew shorter as the day moved forward. The land was waiting for them, just as it always had, and Cole, for the first time in what felt like forever, felt the stirrings of something new within him, a sense of purpose that was deeper than the work ahead. He glanced back toward the house, his mind heavy with the weight of the vow he had made. The promise he had given to Jesse was no mere obligation. It was the thread that would weave his future. And though Lila had not asked for his protection, though she had not once begged for him to stay, Cole knew that his path was now irrevocably intertwined with hers. They were bound together by love, loss, and duty, the same threads that had woven their fates long before the promise had ever been spoken. As they reached the fence, Cole looked out across the land once more, the rising sun casting its brilliant light over the ranch. He inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of both the past and the future pressing on him. It was a strange feeling, this mix of loss and hope, of duty and desire. But in the quiet of that moment, as the earth turned beneath his feet and the sun warmed his face, Cole McAllister knew this was just the beginning. The promise he had made to Jessie, the quiet strength he had seen in Lila's eyes, these would shape the days ahead. And as the first light of day spread across the horizon, he couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, hope had found its place here as well. The sun had barely risen over the vast plains, its light brushing the horizon in soft hues of pink and gold. The day was already stirring with the rhythm of life on the ranch, each task a well-practiced movement, a dance of necessity and survival. Cole McAllister stood with his back to the wind, the quiet hum of morning echoing in the distance as he adjusted the reins of his horse, preparing for the day's work. Lila was already out in the yard, the rhythm of her movements as steady as the land itself. Her worn boots kicked up the dry dust as she bent over, her hands skillful and sure as she knelt to tie off a loose knot on the fence. She hadn't asked for help, but Cole knew better than to think she would. There was a quiet pride in the way she worked, a determination born of necessity and resilience. Her shoulders were straight, her jaw set, yet there was something about the way she moved that spoke to a gentler side of her, one that she rarely showed. Cole's horse snorted, breaking his reverie. He nudged the animal forward and walked toward her, his boots crunching the earth beneath him. He didn't speak at first. There was no need. The sun was still rising, the cattle scattered across the pasture, and the land stretched out before them in all its rugged beauty. But Lila's eyes lifted, and for a brief moment their gazes met. There was no hesitation, no awkwardness, just the quiet understanding that had been growing between them since the night of Jessie's death. "Fence needs mending again," Cole said, his voice rough with the morning chill, though it held a hint of something else, something softer, like a question unspoken. Lila nodded, wiping the back of her hand across her brow. She didn't offer thanks, nor did she need to. Instead, she merely gestured to the broken section of the fence where a few posts had been knocked loose by the cattle. Cole moved to the pile of tools with a grunt, picking up a hammer and a few nails. "Guess we'll have to work fast if we're going to get this done before the heat hits," he said, his tone light but purposeful. "Wouldn't expect anything less," Lila replied, her voice quiet but steady. "Can't afford to waste daylight." They worked in silence for a while, the sound of hammers ringing in the air, the scent of fresh wood mingling with the dusty earth. The rhythm of their movements was easy, familiar, a dance of two people who had spent countless mornings in the same routine. Each swing of the hammer, each twist of the wrench, spoke volumes about the years they had spent carving out a life in this unforgiving land. There were no grand gestures, no empty words, just the steady, dependable hum of labor and the occasional glance shared between them. As the work continued, the quiet intimacy between them deepened. There was something about the way they moved side by side, something that hinted at a bond still unspoken, but no less real. Cole found himself watching Lila more than he intended, noting the way her hair caught the light as she bent over to adjust a post, how the muscles in her arms flexed with each movement, the faint sheen of sweat on her brow. Her face, usually so controlled, softened in the quiet of their labor, and for a moment Cole found himself wondering just how much of the woman he truly knew. "Are their news still giving you trouble?" he asked with a grin, his gaze shifting toward the stubborn creature that stood, ears pinned back, at the edge of the corral. Lila let out a soft laugh, a sound that surprised them both. "You wouldn't believe it," she said, brushing her hands off on her apron. "I think he's got it out for me. Never met an animal so set on making me look foolish." Cole's smile widened, and for a brief moment the weight of the world seemed to lift between them. It was a fleeting thing, but in that laugh, that shared moment of humor, there was something undeniably human about it, a moment of connection that went beyond the harshness of life on the frontier. He had always known Lila to be serious, steady, focused, but in that small laugh there was a glimpse of something softer, something he hadn't quite expected. "Well, maybe I can help you out," Cole offered, his grin still lingering. I've got a way with stubborn animals?" Lila raised an eyebrow, a playful challenge in her eyes. You? You don't strike me as the animal whisperer." "I've got my tricks," Cole said with a wink, stepping toward the mule. It huffed and snorted, clearly unimpressed. But Cole approached with calm assurance, speaking to it in low, steady tones. Lila watched, her arms folded across her chest, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. The mule, after a few moments of initial resistance, seemed to soften under Cole's steady presence, and Lila couldn't help but laugh again at the quiet triumph in his eyes. "Well, I'll be. You actually did it," she said, her voice softer now, her usual reserve giving way to something gentler. Cole stepped back, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them standing in the quiet, sunlit ranch yard. Their gazes held, and in that brief silence something unspoken passed between them, a warmth, a connection, an understanding that neither of them could quite name. It was only a flicker, a fleeting moment, but it was enough to stir something deep inside Cole. As they returned to their work, the air between them seemed lighter, the tasks ahead easier. The day stretched out before them, filled with the steady rhythm of labor, but there was a quiet change in the way they moved together. It was subtle, but it was there. Something that whispered of the slow blossoming of feelings neither of them had anticipated. As the sun climbed higher and the work continued, the hours passed with a peaceful familiarity. By late afternoon, the fence was mended, the cattle tended to, and the work of the day nearly done. Cole climbed onto his horse, his muscles aching from the labor, but his spirit lighter than it had been in weeks. Lila mounted her own horse, the two of them riding side by side toward the west pasture, where the cattle grazed peacefully beneath the golden light of the setting sun. The land, as vast and unyielding as it was, seemed to stretch before them, endless and filled with possibility. The quiet ride was punctuated by nothing more than the steady clip-clop of hooves on the earth and the occasional rustling of the wind through the grass. As they rode, Cole's thoughts drifted, reflecting on the promise he had made, the land that stretched before them, and the woman beside him. There was something in the stillness of the evening that felt like an unspoken agreement, a moment of understanding that they were bound by something more than just the work of the ranch, something deeper, more intimate. The sky, now painted in shades of orange and purple, mirrored the quiet warmth that had begun to grow between them. The fading light of day cast long shadows across the land, but it also illuminated the possibilities that lay ahead, the promise of shared burdens, the quiet moments of understanding, and perhaps the beginning of something new. The evening settled softly over the ranch, its cool embrace a welcome relief after the heat of the day. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a canvas of fading pinks and purples, and the sky above was now an endless expanse of ink. Inside the kitchen, the warmth of a small hearth fire cast flickering shadows along the rough-hewn walls. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the savory aroma of stew simmering in a cast-iron pot on the stove. Lila moved with quiet grace around the small kitchen, the rhythmic clink of utensils and the soft rustle of her apron the only sounds that filled the room. Her movements were fluid, practiced, and yet there was something in her that seemed different tonight, more reflective, less guarded. Cole sat at the small rustic table, the chair creaking beneath his weight as he absently wiped his hands on his trousers. He hadn't meant to intrude on Lila's evening, but after a long day's work, it had felt right to linger, to share the meal. The promise he'd made to Jessie was never far from his thoughts, yet he couldn't help but feel the pull of the woman sitting just across from him, the one who now held the reins of this place. She set a bowl of hearty stew in front of him, her fingers brushing lightly against his as she did, a touch so brief, so subtle, that he almost wondered if it had been a mistake. But her eyes were steady as she met his gaze. The unspoken bond between them was undeniable, as thick and tangible as the night air outside. "Thank you," Cole said, his voice a little hushed as he looked at the food before him, but his gaze never strayed too far from her face. Lila nodded, a small, tight smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. She sat across from him, her back straight, her posture as controlled as always, but tonight there was something softer in her. The faintest hint of vulnerability. Like the weight of the past was beginning to crack the walls she had built around herself. As they ate in silence, the flickering lamplight threw gentle shadows across her features, revealing the delicate line of her jaw, the curve of her lips that had once been full of laughter and joy. But tonight they were drawn in quiet contemplation, as though the words she hadn't spoken in years were finally fighting to get out. Finally, after a few moments, Leela set her spoon down and leaned back in her chair, the movement slow and deliberate, as though she were bracing herself for something. "Oh, Jessie used to sit right where you are," she said, her voice quiet yet steady. She stared at the fire, her eyes distant as though her thoughts had drifted back to a time when things had been simpler. "You used to tell me stories about how we'd grow old together, about what we'd do once the ranch was finally paid off and we had enough to build a real home." Her voice faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. He never got to see any of it. Cole remained silent, his heart heavy with sympathy. He had known Jesse since they were boys, had watched him grow into a man who had fought fiercely for his family and land, and now, sitting across from Lila, it felt as if that fight had passed on to her. Like the weight of the ranch, of the promise, now rested in her hands as much as it did his. "I've tried to keep it all going, Cole," she continued, her voice softening almost to a whisper. "I've tried to make sure everything stays the way he wanted it. But sometimes—" Her words trailed off, and she swallowed hard, as if the next sentence was too heavy to speak. "Sometimes I feel like I'm failing him." Cole shifted in his chair, the quiet intensity of her words settling in his chest. He could feel the weight of her grief, the fierce pride she wore like armor. "You're not failing him," he said, his voice steady, though inside his heart was aching for her. "You're keeping his dream alive. That's more than most could do." Leila's eyes lifted to meet his, and for the briefest of moments their gazes locked. Her eyes were so full of emotion, of longing and sorrow, that it took everything in him not to reach across the table and take her hand in his. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not with the vow still fresh in his mind, not with the memory of Jessie's face still imprinted in his heart. She looked away first, her gaze falling to her hands which were folded in her lap. "I've tried, but I'm tired, Cole. I'm so tired." The vulnerability in her voice was uncharacteristic, a crack in the strong, determined woman she had always been. Cole's throat tightened as he took in her words. He didn't know how to fix this for her, how to ease the burden she carried, but he did know one thing: he would stand by her. He would help her through this. "I'll help," he said, his voice firm yet gentle. "Whatever you need, Lila, I'm here. I'll see this through with you." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she picked up her spoon again, the simple gesture grounding her in the present, as though she needed the small action to center herself. Cole watched her closely, the distance between them palpable, though the air seemed charged with something deeper, something that neither of them could easily name. Finally, after a long, quiet pause, Lila's voice broke the stillness. "I didn't ask you to stay, Cole," she said softly, her eyes never meeting his. "I didn't ask you to take on all this." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I know you didn't. But I'm here all the same." For a moment the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire, its flames casting shifting shadows on the walls. Leela looked down at her bowl, and Cole saw the faintest tremor in her hand as she set the spoon down once more. She didn't speak, but he could feel the weight of her emotions hanging between them. She wasn't just speaking of the rank, she was speaking of something more, of the future, of the promise he had made, and of the quiet tension that had begun to build between them. The conversation drifted into silence, but neither of them was uncomfortable with it. There was something comforting in the quiet, something safe about the presence they shared without words. But the air was thick, charged with the unspoken. Of duty and desire, of loyalty and a longing neither of them was ready to face. After a while, Lila rose from the table and moved toward the window, gazing out at the darkness that had settled over the land. Cole watched her, the glow of the lamplight catching the curve of her profile, casting soft shadows on her face. "I'll take care of it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, though he could hear the determination in it. "The ranch, I mean?" Cole stood and walked toward her, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. He didn't touch her, but his presence beside her was enough, a silent promise that he would remain, would stand by her, just as he had promised. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its embers glowing brightly in the stillness of the night. Outside, the wind whispered across the land, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to stand still, holding its breath. Neither Cole nor Lila spoke again that night, but in the quiet between them something shifted. A delicate balance between duty and the quiet, dangerous stirrings of a love neither was yet willing to name. And as the fire slowly dimmed, so too did the night, the embers representing the lingering promise that would bind them together, and the spark of something forbidden, yet undeniable, between them. The dusty streets of the small frontier town were alive with the usual hum of activity. Wagon wheels creaking, horses snorting, and the shouts of merchants hawking their goods. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the weathered buildings, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air, as if the town was holding its breath. Cole McAllister adjusted the brim of his weathered hat, his eyes scanning the familiar faces of townsfolk. His boots struck the uneven cobblestones with a purposeful rhythm, though his mind was far from the simple business of town errands. He had come to town with a mind to get supplies, but the warning from his old friend, one he hadn't seen in years, kept him uneasy. He pushed open the swinging doors of the saloon, the familiar creak of the hinges bringing a flood of memories. Inside, the haze of tobacco smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the earthy scent of whiskey and sweat. Rugged men leaned against the bar, nursing mugs of beer, while a few weary travellers sat at the far tables, their faces drawn from long journeys. The piano in the corner played a slow, mournful tune, barely rising above the clatter of conversation and laughter. Cole's gaze swept across the room, pausing when it landed on the man he was looking for. Dave Mulligan, an old friend from his younger days, sat at a table near the far wall, a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. Dave's face was weathered, his once dark hair now streaked with grey, but his eyes still held the sharpness of a man who had seen more than his fair share of trouble. As Cole made his way across the room, a sense of foreboding settled into his chest. Something about Dave's expression, his rigid posture, the way his eyes darted nervously from side to side, told Cole that this wasn't just a friendly catch-up. Something was wrong. "Dave," Cole said, his voice low but steady as he slid into the seat across from his old friend. "Haven't seen you in a long while?" Dave's lips tightened in a grim smile, and he leaned in, speaking quietly, as though not wanting anyone else to overhear. "Cole, I'm glad you're here, but I ain't sure you'll like what I've got to tell you." Cole's brow furrowed, but he nodded, the familiar unease creeping through him. "What's going on, Dave?" Dave glanced around the room once more, his voice lowering even further. "Rumors are swirling about a man. A powerful man who's been buying up land left and right. They say he's got eyes on everything around here, including your place." "Lila's ranch?" Cole's stomach tightened at the mention of Lila's name, but he didn't let the flicker of concern show. Instead, he leaned forward, his gaze locked on Dave. "Who's behind this? Who's the man?" Dave hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice tinged with apprehension. "His name's Aldridge. Comes from the south. Word is he's a land baron, one of those rich ones who thinks he can buy up the whole damn territory. He's got money and he's not shy about using it to get what he wants." Cole's jaw tightened. Aldrich. The name was unfamiliar, but the implications were clear. A man like that could ruin everything Jessie had worked for, everything Lila had fought to keep alive. And now it seemed this stranger had set his sights on the ranch that had once belonged to Jessie. "Anything else?" Cole asked, his voice colder now, each word deliberate. Dave leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his greying hair. "There's been talk of men being seen around the outskirts of town. Strangers, armed like they're waiting for something. No one knows exactly what's going on, but I've heard whispers. They say Aldrich's men are moving in, trying to scare folks off their land. Some say they've even threatened a few ranchers, telling them they'd be better off selling now before things get messy." Cole's mind raced, the images flashing through his thoughts too quickly to catch. His hand clenched into a fist, the knuckles whitening as the weight of the news settled in. If Aldrich was truly making a play for the ranchers around here, Lila's land, her livelihood, would be in jeopardy. Cole had made a promise to Jessie. He had sworn to protect Lila, to keep her safe from harm. And now, with this man, this ruthless land baron, threatening to take what was rightfully hers, Cole could feel the stirrings of anger begin to boil within him. "I need to know where he's camped out, Dave. If Aldrich is serious about this, it's time to deal with him," Cole said, his voice low, steady, and filled with an icy resolve. Dave nodded grimly. "I knew you'd say that. You're not one to let things slide. I'll see what I can dig up. But be careful, Cole. I've heard things about Aldrich that'll make a man like you think twice." Cole stood abruptly, his mind already racing with strategies, ways to protect Lila and her land, ways to confront this stranger before things got worse. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a few coins and tossing them onto the table. "Thanks for the warning, Dave," he said, his gaze firm as he met his friend's eyes one last time. "Keep your ears open. I'll take it from here." With that, he turned and made his way to the door, the weight of Dave's words still pressing down on him. He stepped out into the cool evening air, the sounds of the saloon fading behind him, replaced by the quiet chirp of crickets and the distant rustle of wind in the trees. His mind was ablaze with thoughts of what to do next, but one thing was certain. He couldn't let Aldrich take what wasn't his to claim, not while Lila still had a say in the matter, and not while Cole still drew breath. He mounted his horse quickly, the saddle creaking under his weight as he rode out of town, his thoughts already turning toward the next steps. How to protect the ranch, how to stand between Lila and this shadow that now threatened to swallow everything she held dear. The fading light of twilight cast long shadows across the barren stretch of desert road. The land seemed to stretch endlessly, a vast expanse of cracked earth and sparse scrub, dotted only by jagged rocks and the occasional cactus standing tall against the horizon. The air was dry, a persistent heat still clinging to the land despite the setting sun, and the dust swirled in the breeze, clinging to Cole's skin and clothes as he rode slowly, his horse's hooves kicking up a fine cloud of earth with each step. Cole's thoughts were miles away, his mind still spinning from the ominous news he had heard earlier that day. The weight of the threat against Lila's ranch hung heavily on him, a constant reminder of the promise he'd made to Jessie. The land was a hard place, unforgiving and relentless, but it was the life Jessie had chosen, and Cole had vowed to help Lila keep it. But now, with the rumors of the land baron Aldrich spreading through the area like wildfire, he wondered just how far that promise would be tested. The road ahead was empty, save for the occasional gust of wind that sent dust devils spiraling into the air, a stark reminder of the loneliness of the frontier. But then, as the last traces of daylight disappeared behind the jagged mountain peaks, Cole noticed a figure ahead. A rider, cloaked in shadow, moving steadily along the road, silhouetted against the deepening sky. The rider was solitary, their form barely distinguishable in the dimming light, yet Cole instinctively slowed his horse as he approached. The stranger's horse was a sturdy bay, moving with quiet grace, and the rider's posture was still, unmoving, as if they were waiting for something. A sense of unease prickled at the back of Cole's neck, though he couldn't quite say why. There was something about the way the rider sat astride the horse, too calm, too deliberate for a lone traveller on such a desolate stretch of road. As Cole neared, the stranger finally turned, their gaze sharp and knowing as it met his. A chill ran down Cole's spine as he took in the rider's appearance. Dark, weathered clothing, a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of their face, save for a pair of eyes that gleamed in the twilight. Eyes that glimmered with secrets, with knowledge of things yet to come. The stranger's voice, when it came, was low and gravelly, as though it had been honed by years of harsh winds and unspoken words. "Evening," they said, their tone deceptively calm, as if greeting a neighbour on a quiet morning. Cole gave a curt nod, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his rifle. "Evening! What brings you out this way?" The rider studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the question, before answering. "The wind's been speaking of trouble, McAllister. Trouble in places you might not expect." Cole's brow furrowed, the unease growing sharper with each word. "What kind of trouble?" The stranger tilted their head slightly, the movement deliberate, as if considering how much to say. "Some men with eyes for land, powerful men, men who don't take kindly to those who stand in their way." The rider's eyes flicked toward the horizon, the dust swirling around them like the whispered secrets of the desert. "You'd do well to remember that, McAllister. This land, it doesn't forgive. And those who come for it often leave nothing but ruin behind." Cole felt a shiver creep up his spine, though he remained motionless, his expression hardening into a mask of careful neutrality. "Who are you, exactly?" he asked, his voice sharp, though he knew the answer would likely be as cryptic as the rider's words. The stranger smiled, a slow, unsettling curve of the lips that barely reached their eyes. "That's not for you to know. But there's a storm coming, one that will sweep away the weak and the unprepared. If you're not careful, McAllister, you might find yourself caught in it." For a moment the silence stretched between them, heavy and thick, the air growing colder as the last of the sun's warmth bled away. The wind picked up, swirling the dust in the air, sending it spiralling in erratic patterns, as though the very earth was trying to escape the inevitable. Cole could feel the weight of the stranger's words pressing on him, like a shadow that refused to be shaken. There was something dangerous here, something more than just the simple warnings of a passing traveller. Cole hesitated, his mind racing with questions, but before he could speak the rider turned, their horse moving smoothly into the gathering darkness. "Watch your back, McAllister," they called over their shoulder, their voice now barely audible over the wind. "And watch hers too. The storm's already on the horizon." With that the rider disappeared into the twilight, their forms swallowed by the desert's embrace, leaving nothing but the faintest echo of hooves in the distance. Cole sat in silence for a long moment, the desert now eerily still. The breeze had died down, and the only sound was the rhythmic breathing of his horse beneath him. His thoughts raced, pieces of the cryptic warning falling into place, but still he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that lingered in his gut. The mention of Leela, of the storm, had struck a chord deep within him. It was no longer just about the land or the ranch. It was something more, something darker. The road ahead seemed longer now, stretching endlessly into the darkening horizon. With a deep breath, Cole nudged his horse into motion, the quiet clip-clop of hooves the only sound breaking the silence. He turned his gaze back toward the distant outline of the ranch, now only a faint silhouette against the dimming sky. As he rode, his mind remained fixed on the warning, the rider's words echoing in his ears. He had made a promise to Jessie, a vow that would see him through whatever came. But now, with the threat of something darker on the horizon, he wondered just how far that promise would carry him, and what price he would have to pay to protect Lila from the storm that was surely coming their way. The weight of it pressed heavily on him as he rode back toward the ranch, his mind swirling with uncertainty, the quiet stillness of the desert road behind him serving as a haunting reminder of the peril that was drawing closer. The wind had picked up by the time the sleek black carriage appeared on the horizon, its polished wheels kicking up a trail of dust behind it as it rolled toward the ranch. The horses pulling it were purebred, strong and sleek, their muscles rippling under their shiny coats as the coachman cracked the whip, urging them forward. A heavy, oppressive silence seemed to settle over the ranch grounds as the carriage neared, the wind howling in the distance, carrying with it the scent of something foreboding, something that felt like the promise of a storm. Leela stood on the porch of the main house, her hands gripping the railing, eyes narrowing as the carriage approached. She knew this wasn't a social call. The fine, polished vehicle, the expensive trimmings, the men riding alongside it, these were not the sorts of visitors she had hoped for. She had seen enough of the world to recognize power when it was coming for her, and this was it. As the carriage came to a halt at the base of the porch, 4 men dismounted from their horses, their movements efficient and practiced. They were built like men who had spent years in the saddle, their expressions hard, eyes scanning the land with the cold detachment of men accustomed to owning everything they surveyed. From the carriage stepped a man in his early 50s, tall, with dark hair speckled with grey at the temples. His face was sharp and calculating, like a predator who had studied his prey long enough to know how to break it. The man wore a dark suit, tailored to perfection, and a black felt hat that shaded his cold, calculating eyes. He stood tall, his posture erect, as though the very land beneath him belonged to him already. "Mr. Aldrich!" The name alone sent a ripple of unease through Lila's chest. She had heard of him, of course. Rumours of his ruthless business dealings, of his acquisitions of land across the state. But she had never expected him to come here, not to her ranch, not to Jessie's land. Aldrich took a step toward the porch, his boots scraping against the wooden steps as he surveyed the property with a predatory gaze. His eyes lingered on the fields, the barn, the house, and finally on Lila, standing just a few feet away, her stance unwavering. He smiled, a cold, calculated smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Quite the piece of land you have here, Mrs. McAllister," Aldrich said, his voice smooth and deep, but with an edge of something darker beneath it. "I can see why your late husband worked so hard to make it thrive. It's a shame, really, what's become of these lands in recent years. You've certainly done well to keep it afloat." Lila straightened, her gaze steady as she met his cold eyes. She refused to let the tremor of unease show on her face. "It's my land, Mr. Aldrich, my husband's legacy. I intend to keep it." Aldrich chuckled, the sound low and almost condescending. "Oh, I'm sure you do. But there are ways to make things easier, you know, ways to ensure that this place remains prosperous if only you were willing to see the opportunities before you." He took another step closer, his eyes roaming over the ranch like a hawk circling its prey. "I'm willing to make you an offer, Mrs. McAllister. A very generous one, I assure you. If you were to sell me this land, I could promise you a life of luxury, free from worry and hardship. Think of the possibilities, the wealth, the security." Leela's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm not selling. Not now." "Not ever?" Aldrich's smile faded, his eyes darkening. "You'll come to realize, Mrs. McAllister, that there are some things you just can't control, and when I want something, I take it. It's just business." He glanced over his shoulder at his men, who stood silent, watching the exchange with cold detachment. "I'm giving you the chance to make this easy for yourself. Take the offer, and walk away with a life free from the burden of this place." Leela's pulse quickened, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy shroud. She had always known the West was a harsh place, a place where men like Aldrich thrived. But this was more than just business. This was a threat, and she refused to bow to it. "I said no," Lila said firmly, her voice gaining strength with each word. "This land is mine. and I'll fight to keep it no matter what." Aldrich stared at her for a long moment, his gaze as cold as the desert wind. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he removed his hat and placed it back on his head. "Very well, Mrs. McAllister, we all have our pride. But know this, I always get what I want." He turned on his heel, his men falling into step behind him. "Enjoy your ranch while you can," he called back. "It won't be yours for long." The carriage lurched forward, and the men mounted their horses, leaving the ranch in silence. Leela stood there for a moment, watching them ride away, her heart racing. She had felt the weight of Aldrich's words, the threat in them, the promise of danger looming on the horizon. She hadn't seen the last of him. Later that evening, the sky had darkened to a deep purple, the last slivers of daylight fading behind the distant mountains. The ranch was quiet, the usual sounds of animals settling in for the night blending with the rustle of wind through the tall grass. But the peace was only an illusion. Inside the barn, where Lila and Cole had retreated, the tension between them hung thick in the air. Cole paced the length of the barn, his boots striking the wooden floor with purpose, his fists clenched. The anger in him was simmering just beneath the surface, barely contained. He had watched the encounter unfold from the shadows, his heart hammering in his chest as he saw Aldrich's threat take shape. Every word the man had spoken had stoked the fire of Cole's protective instinct. Lila leaned against one of the barn's wooden supports, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But Cole could see the tightness in her jaw, the flicker of fear in her eyes, even though she refused to let it show. "We can't let him get away with this," Cole said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "That man is a snake. He's got his eyes on this land, and he won't stop until he takes it." Leela's gaze softened, but her voice remained firm. "I won't give in. Jesse worked too hard for this. I can't just sell it to him, not for any amount of money." "I know," Cole replied, stopping in his tracks to face her. He could feel the heat of his anger rising again, the protectiveness he felt for her, for this place taking over. "But it's not just about selling. He's threatening us. And I'll be damned if I let him take this from you, from Jesse, not without a fight." Leela looked at him, the weight of the moment pressing on them both. For a moment there was silence between them, thick with the unspoken understanding of what was at stake. "I'll fight too," she said softly. "But I don't know what we're up against. Aldrich is a powerful man, and we're not prepared for what he can do." Cole's gaze softened as he took a step closer, his voice steady and filled with resolve. "He will be. I swear to you, Leela, I won't let anything happen to this place. I made a promise to Jesse, and I'll keep it." Lila's heart swelled at his words, a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite name. There was something about Cole, something in the way he stood there, unwavering, that made her believe he would do whatever it took to protect her, to protect this land. As the last light of day disappeared behind the mountains, Cole's gaze turned toward the horizon, where dark clouds were beginning to gather. The storm wasn't just in the sky, it was coming for them, and he was ready to face it no matter the cost. "I won't let him take this from us," Cole muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. "Not without a fight." The early morning light crept slowly into the ranch's main house, casting long golden beams across the wooden floors. The house was still and quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old beams as the building settled in the coolness of the dawn. The faint scent of coffee lingered in the air, the comforting aroma weaving through the sparse but homey furnishings of the living room. Leela sat at the small wooden table by the window, her hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold, her gaze fixed on the world outside. The vast land stretched before her, the fields swaying gently in the breeze, the distant hills wrapped in a blanket of mist. It was the same view she had always known, the same land that had sustained her and Jesse, the same land she had sworn to protect. But now, with the ranch under threat and Cole's promise hanging over them, Leela found herself torn. Gratitude for Cole's protection swirled inside her like a whirlwind, but so did the gnawing fear that his steadfast devotion to duty might overshadow something more fragile and tender between them. She hadn't invited him here. Not really. He had come because of a promise. Because of the vow he had made to Jessie. She knew that, and the knowledge left a bittersweet taste in her mouth. The silence in the room deepened, and she couldn't shake the thought that perhaps the same duty that bound Cole to this land, to her, might also keep him from seeing her. Really seeing her. She had seen the way his eyes had softened toward her in the past weeks, the quiet moments of understanding that passed between them. But every time their gazes met, every time she felt a flutter of something she had long buried in her heart, she couldn't escape the sense that the man she was coming to rely on might never fully choose her. Not while that promise to Jessie was still looming over them. Could she truly open her heart again, she asked herself, her fingers gripping the rim of her mug? Could she let go of the fear that had kept her locked in grief for so long? Her thoughts drifted back to Jessie, to the life they had shared, the dreams they had built together. He had been her world, the one constant in a life marked by the uncertainty of the frontier. And then he was gone, taken from her too soon, leaving behind only memories, and the land he had fought so hard to build. But now there was Cole. He was strong, dependable, and undeniably kind. Yet, as much as she appreciated his help, there was something in her heart, something deeply ingrained, that made her hesitate. She knew what love was. She had known it with Jessie. She knew what it felt like to trust someone completely, to give them all of yourself. But could she do that again? Could she truly risk her heart after all the loss she had endured? The sound of boots on the porch steps broke her reverie, and she looked up as Cole stepped into the room. His presence was like a shadow crossing the threshold, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. His broad shoulders filled the doorway, and his steady gaze softened as it found her sitting there, lost in thought. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough with the stillness of morning. Lila forced a smile, her heart fluttering despite herself. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind, I suppose." Cole nodded, the concern in his eyes deepening as he crossed the room. He placed a hand gently on the back of the chair, his gaze sweeping over her. The connection between them was undeniable, but she could feel the invisible wall that had begun to rise between them. A wall built from duty, from promises, from the weight of the past. "I heard some things in town," he said, his voice lowering as though the very words he was about to speak were meant only for her. "There have been rumors, men moving around the outskirts, strange happenings in the night. People are saying Aldrich's men are getting bolder. We need to be ready." Lila felt a coldness settle over her, the gravity of his words sinking into her chest like a stone. The constant threat of Aldrich, of losing this land, was one she had carried for so long, but hearing it from Cole's lips felt different. He wasn't just a protector, he was becoming something more. Yet even now, as he spoke of duty, of protection, a small voice inside her asked, "What does this mean for us?" As his words hung in the air, the distance between them felt palpable, a chasm that had begun to widen since Aldrich's arrival. Cole's role here, his promise to Jessie, kept him tethered to a cause that was larger than either of them. And she? She was left wondering where she fit in this tangled web of duty and desire. The storm had come swiftly. The winds picked up around midday, carrying with them the scent of rain and the promise of something turbulent. By the time the afternoon sky darkened to a deep grey, the first heavy raindrops began to fall, splattering against the wooden porch and the fields beyond. The air was thick with the scent of earth, of the storm that was now swirling above them. Lila stood at the edge of the porch, her arms folded across her chest, watching the rain fall in sheets. It was as though the sky itself was mirroring the turmoil that had taken root in her heart. She hadn't meant for things to come to this, hadn't meant for the quiet moments between her and Cole to turn into something so fragile, so full of unspoken words. Cole stood in the doorway, his boots heavy on the wooden floor as he watched her, his brow furrowed with concern. She had been distant since the news he'd brought that morning, her thoughts wrapped up in things she wouldn't share, and for the first time he wondered if the wall between them was something he couldn't break through. "What's going on with you, Lila?" he asked, his voice laced with frustration. "I'm trying to help you, trying to protect you." Lila's head snapped toward him, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and pain. "You don't understand, Cole," she spat, her voice rising with the storm. "You think you're protecting me, but all you're doing is suffocating me with your promises. Your duty to Jessie, your need to fix everything. It's all you've cared about from the start. And I'm just here, caught in the middle." Cole's fists clenched, the storm outside matching the one brewing within him. He took a step toward her, his voice low but filled with raw emotion. "You think I don't care about you? That this isn't my fight too? I swore to Jessie that I'd look after you. I made a promise, Lila. And that promise means something to me. But so do you. You think this is just about the ranch. This is about us, about what I'm trying to build here with you." Lila shook her head, the conflict in her eyes so painfully clear. "I don't need a protector, Cole. I need someone who sees me, not just a promise, not just the land. You're living in the shadow of something you can't change, and I'm afraid that if I let myself get too close, I'll only end up getting hurt." The words struck Cole like a blow to the chest, but he couldn't back down. He couldn't let her believe that he would ever put a promise over her. He reached for her, his hand trembling slightly as he cupped her chin, tilting her face to meet his gaze. "I'm not leaving you, Lila. I'm not leaving this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here because I want to be, and I'll fight for you, for this, with everything I've got. Don't you dare think that this is about anything less than us." Lila stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as she stared up at him, her defenses crumbling under the weight of his words. The storm raged around them, the rain pelting the porch like the pounding of their own hearts, each beat heavy with the weight of everything unspoken between them. But just as quickly, the moment seemed to slip away, the tension between them still thick but suddenly fragile. Lila pulled back slightly, her breath catching in her throat, unable to look him in the eye. With a sharp intake of breath, she turned toward the rain, her shoulders sagging under the weight of everything she couldn't say. And as Cole stood in the doorway watching her, the storm outside seemed to mirror the quiet, turbulent storm growing between them, a storm neither of them was quite ready to face. And so the chapter ended, with neither of them knowing what came next, but with the unspoken understanding that the storm, both outside and in their hearts, was far from over. Tattoo. The morning mist clung to the land like a shroud, the earth still damp with dew, the air cool and heavy. The trail ahead of them was a winding path that cut through the dense brush, the trees lining the road whispering in the soft breeze. A faint, eerie silence settled over the land, broken only by the rhythmic clip-clop of their horses' hooves as Cole and Lila rode side by side, moving toward the farthest reaches of the property. Lila's gaze drifted over the vast expanse of the land, the beauty of the morning somehow underscored by a nagging sense of unease. Ever since Eldridge's visit, an unspoken tension had hovered over the ranch, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Cole had been more vigilant lately, his protective instincts growing sharper, and Lila couldn't help but wonder if he saw something she couldn't, something dangerous that she was trying to ignore. "You okay?" Cole's voice broke the silence, and she looked over at him, startled from her thoughts. "I'm fine," Lila replied with a small smile, though the unease that had settled in her stomach was still there. "Just thinking." Cole nodded, but said nothing more. The tension between them had only grown since their confrontation on the porch, an awkward distance lingering in the spaces between their words. Lila wished she could ignore it, but the truth was, it was harder now to reconcile the man she had come to depend on with the man bound by his promise to Jessie. The sound of a distant bird call echoed through the mist, the only sign of life in the otherwise quiet morning. But then the eerie stillness shifted. A faint rustling came from the underbrush, just on the edge of their hearing. Cole's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle at his side, his sharp eyes scanning the landscape around them, his body tensing. Before Lila could ask what was wrong, the first shot rang out, shattering the silence with brutal force. The bullet whizzed past Cole, missing him by mere inches. His horse reared up, startled by the sound, and Cole yanked the reins, keeping the animal steady. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as she ducked low, instinctively pulling her own horse back to avoid the gunfire. "Get down!" Cole shouted, his voice a sharp command. Lila didn't hesitate. She dropped from her saddle, hitting the ground hard, her breath caught in her throat as she scrambled behind a nearby rock. Cole was already there, his body positioned between her and the unseen attackers, his rifle aimed at the dense line of trees where the shots had come from. A second shot rang out, followed by a third. This time the bullet clipped the edge of Cole's hat, sending it flying off his head. He cursed under his breath, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but the attackers were elusive, their figures concealed by the mist and the trees. "Stay low!" Cole ordered, his voice steady but urgent. "We've got to move, Lila. Stay close." He didn't wait for a response. He grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet, his grip firm, and they moved quickly toward a cluster of boulders further up the trail, trying to shield themselves from the next wave of gunfire. The sound of hooves behind them made Layla's heart stop for a moment. Outlaws. Dozens of them, emerging from the mist on horseback, masked faces, twisted in cold menace. They circled around them, weapons drawn, closing in from all sides. "Don't make this any harder than it has to be," one of the outlaws called out, his voice low and guttural. "The boss just wants the land, McAllister. Give it up and we'll let you walk away." Cole's grip tightened on his rifle, his face hardening with determination. "You're not getting this land," he growled, his voice thick with anger. The outlaws sneered, their eyes gleaming behind their masks. One of them raised his gun, aiming directly at Lila. The shot rang out in the stillness, but Cole was quicker. He fired first, the bullet hitting the outlaw square in the chest. The man dropped from his horse, his body crumpling to the ground in a lifeless heap. Chaos erupted. Gunshots rang out in every direction as Cole and Lila scrambled to find cover. The sound of bullets ricocheting off rocks and trees filled the air. Lila's heart raced, her ears ringing with the violence of it all. She had never known fear like this, not even when Jesse had gone off to war. Cole fired again, his shots precise, but he was outnumbered. He ducked low as a bullet narrowly missed him, the force of it grazing the side of his coat. His eyes flicked toward Lila, watching her carefully as she huddled behind the rocks. She was safe for the moment, but for how long? The outlaws continued to circle them, their shots coming faster now, more erratic as they pushed forward. Cole moved with precision, his rifle steady in his hands, his eyes focused on the enemies before him. But every shot, every movement seemed to bring them closer to being overwhelmed. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the attack stopped. The outlaws, realizing they were losing ground, turned their horses and fled into the mist, disappearing as quickly as they had come. The sound of their retreating hooves slowly faded, leaving only the ringing silence behind. Cole didn't immediately lower his rifle. His eyes scanned the area, his body tense, waiting for another attack that didn't come. Only then did he allow himself to exhale, the adrenaline flooding out of him in waves. He quickly moved to Lila's side, crouching down beside her, his face pale with the effort to remain steady. "You're okay?" he asked, his voice rough with concern as he touched her arm, his fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Lila nodded, her chest heaving, her heart still pounding with the rawness of the experience. She didn't trust herself to speak, not yet. The shock of the attack still gripped her, the sight of Cole's calm resolve in the face of danger leaving her with a mix of awe and a terrible realization. They had been vulnerable, the danger was real, and it had come far too close. Cole stood and began to reload his rifle, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't speak at first, his gaze distant as he surveyed the scene. The outlaws were gone, but the damage had already been done. The fear still gripped Lila's heart, a gnawing feeling in the pit of her stomach that wouldn't let go. "I should have seen it coming," Cole finally said, his voice low and filled with regret. "I should have gotten you out of here sooner. It's my fault." Leela looked up at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "We didn't know," she said softly, though she couldn't quite shake the image of the outlaw's gun aimed at her. "But we're both lucky. Too lucky." Victoria, with another quick look, and from her own bull and mortar, than unheard of. Cole glanced over at her, his expression darkening. "I should have protected you better. I promised I'd keep you safe, and I nearly failed." His guilt cut through the tension between them, and Lila felt the quiet surge of emotion rising in her chest. They had both been caught off guard. But Cole's need to carry the weight of responsibility for her safety was a burden neither of them could fully escape. The dust of the ambush still hung in the air, the oppressive silence settling over them like a heavy blanket. But as the mist began to lift, revealing the vast landscape once more, a sobering realization dawned on both of them. The fight for this land, for their future, was only beginning, and Cole's vow would drive him forward, no matter the cost. But for now, as the reality of the attack settled over them both, the road ahead seemed infinitely more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The barn was dark, save for the faint flicker of a single lantern hanging from the rafters. Its light danced over the rough-hewn wooden beams and spilled across the straw-covered floor, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The scent of hay mixed with the earthy smell of damp wood and the faint undertone of blood, Lila's blood, clung to the air like a sickening reminder of the morning's chaos. Cole moved quickly, his boots heavy against the barn's floor, the weight of his steps punctuated by the urgency that hung in the air. Leela sat propped up against one of the bales of hay, her face pale, her lips pressed tight as she fought to hold back the pain. The gash on her arm was ugly, a deep, angry wound where a bullet had grazed her. Blood stained her shirt and her breathing was shallow, each exhale sharp with the sting of injury. But it wasn't the injury that tore at Cole's heart. It was the look of fear in her eyes. "You're going to be all right," he said, his voice gruff, though the words barely soothed his own troubled mind. He crouched beside her, his hands hovering over her wound, unsure of how to help her. He had fought off the attackers, but this helplessness was something he wasn't prepared for. Lila winced as he gently touched the wound, her breath catching in her throat. She had been so brave during the ambush, so steadfast in the face of danger, but now, in the relative safety of the barn, the weight of it all seemed to crash over her. Her fingers clenched the rough fabric of her skirt, the tension in her jaw betraying the pain she refused to voice. "I can't believe this is happening," she whispered, her eyes shimmering with something that could have been anger or fear, or maybe both. "First Aldridge and his threats, and now this. We've been forced into a corner, Cole." Her words hit him harder than they should have, and he drew back slightly, anger flaring within him at the thought of Aldrich and his men still lurking in the shadows. He hadn't been able to keep her safe, not entirely. His promise to Jessie had been to protect her, but here she was, hurt because of him. It was all becoming too much. "Don't say that," he bit out, his voice rising in frustration. "This is my fault. You shouldn't have been out there. You think I don't know that?" Leela interrupted, her voice sharp, tinged with bitterness. "You think I wanted to be caught up in this? But I'm not some helpless woman you have to protect, Cole. I can take care of myself." She winced again as he tried to clean the wound, but she didn't flinch away this time. Instead, her eyes flashed with something more than pain, something that was buried deep within her. She had always been strong, always carried the weight of everything with quiet dignity, but this was different. The rawness of her anger, of the fear she was trying to hide, made her seem more fragile than she ever had been. Cole's chest tightened as he worked, his hands moving deftly, his mind racing. He had always promised to keep her safe, but it had never felt like this before. He had never seen her this vulnerable, and the truth was, he didn't know how to help her. He had sworn to be the protector, to stand between her and whatever dangers lurked in the dark, but now, with her blood staining his hands, the weight of that promise felt like a curse. Leila, His voice faltered, and he didn't know how to finish. The words were stuck in his throat, tangled between the duty he owed and the desire that had been growing in him since the moment he'd met her. I know you're trying to protect me, Lila said, her voice softer now, though the edge of frustration remained. But I'm not a child, Cole. I've had to fight for everything I have, and I'm tired of living in the shadow of a promise made to a man who's not even here anymore. I know you feel like you owe it to him, but I can't keep living like this. Not with you treating me like I'm fragile. Her words stung, a sharp, jagged truth that cut into him like a blade. He couldn't blame her for feeling this way. He could see it in her eyes, the way her trust in him had begun to fray at the edges. But still, the thought of her walking into danger without him, without his protection, filled him with a cold terror. You don't understand, he said, his voice tight with emotion. I made a vow to Jessie. I swore I'd protect you, no matter what. And that vow is everything to me. It's the one thing that keeps me going. He paused, his hands trembling as he finished bandaging the wound, the reality of his own feelings becoming clearer than ever before. But the truth was, the vow he had made wasn't the only thing binding him to her. He had promised to protect her, yes, but he had also found himself wanting more, wanting her. And that desire was becoming more dangerous than any enemy they faced. Lila's gaze softened, but the pain in her eyes remained. I know you made that promise, Co, and I know it means something to you, but we have to matter too. We have to be more than just the past. I don't want to be something you're chained to, not like this. The words were like a slap, the weight of them sinking deep into his chest. He couldn't speak at first, couldn't find the words to explain how it had never been just about duty with her. It had never been just about the promise. But the truth was, the weight of that vow had always been there, heavy, suffocating, pulling him further away from the life he thought he could have with her. Lila was everything he had come to care for, but the shadows of the past lingered over them, casting everything they might have had in doubt. Lila, he whispered, his voice barely audible as he stood up, his back to her. He couldn't meet her eyes just then. It felt like his own heart was too heavy with guilt to bear. I don't know how to be what you want me to be. I promised Jessie, and I don't know if I can break that. The silence that followed was thick, painful. The tension in the room swelled as the storm outside began to rage louder, the wind howling against the barn and the rain hammering against the walls like a drumbeat. Cole felt trapped between two forces, the vow that bound him and the feelings he was afraid to face. He couldn't break his promise, but with every passing day he feared that his promise might be the very chain that kept him from the one thing he truly wanted. His gaze lifted toward the dimly lit rafters of the barn, the lantern casting long, flickering shadows on the wooden beams. He stared at the ceiling, the weight of his own internal struggles settling like a stone in his chest. He had sworn to keep Lila safe, and he would, no matter the cost. But as the rain continued to pound the roof, Cole couldn't escape the painful truth that the cost might be more than he could ever afford. And the doubt that began to seep into his heart, that fear that his duty might ultimately destroy them both, felt like a storm that would never pass. The night stretched endlessly before Cole, the vast expanse of the plain sprawling out in every direction, empty and unforgiving. The pale moon hung high in the sky, casting a cold silver light over the barren landscape. It was a landscape he had known well, one that had witnessed countless battles, both physical and emotional. But tonight it felt different. The weight of it was heavier, the silence more oppressive. Cole urged his horse forward, the steady clip-clop of hooves the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. His body ached from the tension, from the constant vigilance of the past weeks, but it wasn't his muscles that were sore, it was his heart. He hadn't planned on leaving, but the crushing weight of guilt had driven him away from the ranch, from the one person who needed him most. He hadn't wanted to go, but he couldn't stay, not while the turmoil inside him was so fierce, so unbearable. His mind was in chaos, the thoughts swirling like the dust on the wind, unfocused, erratic, and filled with doubt. "You promised, Cole," the words echoed in his mind, Jesse's voice clear, as though his best friend was still standing beside him, holding him to the vow that had bound them together so many years ago. "Take care of her," Jesse had said with his last breath, his hand gripping Cole's as he lay dying in the dusty, blood-soaked earth. "Don't let her be alone. Don't let her lose everything." Cole had sworn it then, just as he swore it every time his mind returned to that moment, when Jesse's body had grown still, and his last words had settled into the very marrow of his bones. "I'll protect her, I swear it." But that promise had taken on a weight that no man could bear alone. He had come to care for Leela, to feel a bond between them that was undeniable, but each time his heart grew closer to hers, it felt like he was betraying the very thing he had sworn to uphold. "This isn't love, Cole," he thought bitterly, his hands tightening on the reins. "This is duty. This is nothing but duty. You're failing her if you think otherwise." The thought settled over him like a cold hand on his chest, tightening and suffocating. He had always been driven by his promises, but lately he could feel them slipping through his fingers like sand, and it wasn't just the promise to Jesse that tormented him. It was the growing realization that he wanted something more, something he couldn't have, something he couldn't allow himself to desire. His mind drifted back to the days following Jesse's death, to the raw grief that had marked every moment of those first weeks, the crushing weight of loss, of knowing that his best friend would never return, had been almost unbearable. But it had been that grief that had driven him to Lila's side, to watch over her, to make sure she wouldn't face the future alone. He had seen her strength, her resilience, but he had also seen the cracks, the moments when she had broken, when the weight of everything was too much for her to carry. And he had promised to be there for her, he had promised to protect her, but now, it felt like that promise was both a gift and a curse. Leela had begun to rely on him, to trust him, and with each passing day, the bond between them had deepened, but he couldn't allow it to become something more. Not when every part of him was still bound by that vow to Jesse. "She's not yours to claim," he reminded himself, trying to silence the part of him that longed for her touch, for her love. A sharp wind whipped across the ridge, stirring the dust that clung to the earth, and Cole's thoughts faltered for a moment. His gaze swept across the empty plains, the land stretching out in all directions, the vastness of it swallowing him whole. The wind howled through the sagebrush, a reminder of how small they all were, how insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Cole pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the ridge, his eyes scanning the horizon. The dark silhouette of the land stretched out before him, vast and lonely. The ranch, with its battered fences and struggling fields, lay far behind him, a distant memory. He could almost feel the weight of the land pressing down on him, the weight of his duty, of the promise he had made. And yet as he sat there, alone in the quiet darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away, something more than just the promise, something more than just the land. "What am I doing?" Cole's breath caught in his throat, the frustration of it all threatening to overwhelm him. He had come out here to find clarity, to get away from the confusion that seemed to follow him wherever he went, but now the questions only grew louder. Was he doing the right thing? Was he really keeping Lila safe? Or was he just hiding behind a promise that was keeping him from living? The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the occasional gust of wind and the distant howl of coyotes in the hills. The weight of his internal struggle settled on him like a physical burden. He couldn't run from it forever. He had to face it, or it would destroy him from the inside out. "You're not betraying Jesse," he told himself firmly, though the words felt hollow in his chest. "You're honoring him. You're doing what you promised. Don't forget that. Don't lose sight of what matters." But as the words echoed in his mind, they didn't feel like truth. They felt like an excuse, a way to justify the distance he was creating between himself and the one person who mattered most. The darkness deepened around him, and the wind grew colder. Cole pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, the chill seeping into his bones. He knew he couldn't stay out here forever. He had to return to the ranch, to face Lila, to face the choices he had made. But as he rode back toward the ranch, the weight of his thoughts pressing on him, he knew one thing for certain. This internal struggle was far from over. And no matter how much he wanted to escape it, no matter how much he wanted to run from the truth of his feelings, he knew that someday it would have to be confronted. The dark, silent expanse of the plains stretched before him, an endless void that seemed to echo his desolation. His heart felt like it was being pulled in two directions, one toward the vow he had made, and the other toward the woman who had begun to fill the spaces of his life in ways he never expected. As the night deepened, Cole's mind remained clouded, the struggle within him unresolved. The path ahead seemed uncertain, the burden of the promise he had made growing heavier with every step. And for the first time, he wondered if the very thing that had once bound him so tightly to his past was now the chain that kept him from the future he truly desired. The town on the outskirts of the frontier was as worn and weathered as the men who passed through it. Dust clung to every surface, its streets narrow and rough, the buildings crooked with age, their timber frames bowed under the weight of years of neglect. The air, thick with the smell of the earth and sweat, seemed to hang over the town like an oppressive blanket. A few weather-beaten horses were tethered to the posts outside, their riders either inside the tavern or somewhere lost in their own thoughts. Cole McAllister's boots kicked up dust as he walked down the main street, his gaze sweeping over the sleepy town. He had ridden here seeking nothing more than a place to rest, a momentary reprieve from the internal storm that had been raging in his mind ever since he had left the ranch. The weight of his promise to Jessie, of his growing feelings for Lila, all of it had become a burden he couldn't bear. His mind was tired, his heart even more so. The light from the tavern's grimy windows flickered like a beacon in the dark, drawing him in despite his reservations. He hadn't planned on staying long, but the fatigue in his bones pulled him toward it. He stepped through the swinging door, the creak of the hinges loud in the otherwise quiet space. The tavern was small, dimly lit by lanterns that cast long shadows on the wooden floors. A few old-timers sat, hunched over their drinks at the bar, their eyes dull with years of hard living. The bartender gave him a cursory glance but said nothing as Cole made his way to an empty table in the corner. The place had the familiar scent of stale beer and smoke, the air thick with the kind of quiet that only comes from a place where dreams had long since withered away. Cole ordered a modest meal, a stew and a cup of whiskey, and settled into his seat, his shoulders still stiff with the weight of his thoughts. He had come here hoping for some solitude, but as the minutes passed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was pulling him into the moment. It was then that an older man entered the tavern, his gait slow but steady. He wore a well-worn cowboy hat, his face lined with years of sun and hard living, the kind of face that seemed to carry the stories of 100 men who had lived and died in this unforgiving land. His clothes were weathered, his boots dusty from travel, but there was a calm strength about him, an air of quiet wisdom that seemed to fill the space around him. The man surveyed the room before his eyes settled on Cole, and he gave him a small nod, as though recognizing him in the way two drifters might. A brief, unspoken acknowledgement of shared experience. Cole returned the nod, but before he could turn back to his meal, the old man approached and sat across from him without a word. His movements were deliberate but easy, as though he had been doing this for as long as he could remember. "You mind if I sit?" the old man asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Cole looked up, meeting the stranger's eyes. "Not at all," he replied, a touch of curiosity creeping into his tone. The man's presence was calming, somehow, even if his features were hardened by years of struggle. The old man didn't need an invitation to speak. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the room before he looked at Cole again. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" Cole hesitated, then nodded. "I guess you could say that. Just needed a bit of time to think." The man chuckled softly, a deep, gravelly sound. "Ain't much thinking to do around here. This town's seen the rise and fall of more men than I care to count. The land, the people, everything keeps spinning like it always does. But some folks, they're the ones who get caught in the wheels." He took a sip of his whiskey, his eyes narrowing as he studied Cole. "And it looks like you're caught, son. Caught up in something you don't know how to untangle." Cole's chest tightened. The words hit too close to the truth, but he didn't shy away from them. "I'm not sure I can untangle it," he said quietly, his voice low and heavy with the weight of his internal struggle. The old man studied him for a moment longer, his weathered gaze piercing, as though reading the very soul of the man sitting before him. "Maybe not, but you got a choice, son. We all do. You can keep letting the weight of promises tie you down, or you can decide to live for yourself for once." The words landed with the quiet force of a thunderclap, the meaning sinking deep into Cole's gut. His mind flickered to Jesse's final moments, the words he had spoken, the promise he had made. "Protect her, Cole. Don't let her be alone. She's everything now." He had made that promise, but had it become a chain that bound him to a life he wasn't sure he was ready for? Had his duty to Jesse replaced everything else, including the life that was quietly unfolding between him and Lila? "Don't get me wrong," the old man continued, his voice softer now. "Honor's worth something. But there's a cost. You can't carry someone else's weight forever, not without losing yourself." Cole's heart clenched, the words stirring something inside him, a restless stirring he hadn't been able to name until now. Could he live with the weight of Jesse's promise forever? Or was it time to lay it down, to start living for what he wanted, for what he needed? The old man's voice broke through his thoughts again. "You've got to decide, boy. You can't just keep riding the line between duty and desire, between what you owe and what you want. One will eat you alive, and the other will drive you mad." Cole's breath hitched at the clarity of it all. The man's words, simple as they were, felt like a revelation. It was more than just duty. It was about living, about finding a way to honor the past without letting it rob him of the future he might still have. "You're right," Cole said, his voice rough as the weight of the old man's wisdom settled over him. "I don't know what to do with all of this, with my past, with her." The old man smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening as he chuckled. "No one ever does. Ha! But you've got to make the call. That's the thing about promises, son. They're made to be kept, but they're also made to be broken when they stop being the right thing." Cole sat back, the quiet between them filling with the weight of those words. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while he could see a path ahead. Uncertain, yes, but a path he was ready to walk. He stood, tipping his hat to the old man as he moved toward the door, the flicker of the lantern light casting shadows on the floor. He felt the stirrings of something inside him, a faint spark of determination, rekindling in the face of the unknown. "I'm going to figure this out," he said, his voice steady now, his resolve hardening. "I'll figure out what comes next." The old man nodded, his eyes twinkling with quiet approval. "That's all any of us can do, son." As Cole stepped into the cool night air, the world seemed just a little less heavy. He didn't know how, or when, or even if he could truly free himself from the promise that weighed on him, but he knew one thing: the road ahead was his to walk, and for the first time he felt the stirrings of hope, of change. Flicker inside him. That, he was certain, meant they had. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward reclaiming the future he had been afraid to claim. The town square was alive with a restlessness that Cole McAllister hadn't seen before. Whispers of rebellion floated on the wind. carried by the voices of ranchers, former soldiers, and the few outcasts who had come to call this part of the frontier home. The air was thick with tension, and the bustling market stalls seemed almost out of place amidst the charged atmosphere that had settled over the town like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Cole stood near the center of it all, his posture tall and commanding as he surveyed the crowd that had begun to gather. Word of his challenge to Aldrich's reign had spread like wildfire, and now the town was alive with a mixture of apprehension and something else, something that Cole hadn't expected. Hope. He had never been a man who sought attention, but the injustice that had taken root in the region, the corruption that Aldrich had spread like a disease, had stirred something in Cole that could no longer be ignored. He had sworn to protect the ranch, to protect Lila, and now he knew what he had to do. Aldrich wasn't just a threat to the land, he was a threat to everything they stood for. "Listen up, folks!" Cole called out, his voice strong, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd as he stepped forward. The familiar weight of his rifle across his back and the steady presence of his gaze demanded attention. One by one, the townsfolk turned toward him, drawn to his urgency and the conviction that burned in his chest. "Aldrich thinks he can buy us out. He thinks we'll fall to his threats. But I'm here to tell you this land doesn't belong to him, and neither do we." The crowd shifted, a few men and women exchanging uncertain glances, but they were listening now, hanging on his every word. Cole's eyes scanned the faces around him. Men whose families had tilled the soil for generations, women whose courage had been tested time and time again, and the worn faces of soldiers who had seen too many battles to turn back now. "We stand together or fall alone," Cole continued, his voice rising with each word. "Pete Aldrich is no different from the rest of the land grabbers who've come through here, but he's one man, and we are many. We can take this fight to him, but only if we stand united." There was a pause, a brief stillness, and then, like a spark catching dry tinder, a voice from the crowd called out, "What's your plan, McAllister?" The question was direct, and Cole turned to meet the speaker's eyes. A tall man in his late 30s, rough around the edges, but his eyes were sharp. Too sharp for someone who had spent his life as a drifter. A former soldier, by the looks of him. "I've been thinking on this for days," Cole said, drawing himself up straighter. "Aldrich's men are scattered, and he's been using fear to keep everyone in line. But that's his weakness. Fear doesn't hold when it's met with strength. We're going to hit him where it hurts. We'll take out his supply lines, sabotage his operations, and we'll do it under his nose. I've seen enough to know that we can turn the tide if we strike quick." Another man, shorter and stockier, with a face weathered by years of hard labor, stepped forward. "I've heard the stories. You're a good man, McAllister. But what makes you think anyone here is willing to risk everything?" Cole's gaze locked onto his. "What's left to risk?" he asked quietly. The words hung in the air, and the crowd shifted uneasily. "Aldrich is buying up our land, our future. If we don't fight now, we lose everything, our homes, our families, our way of life. But if we do this together, we can stand against him, we can take back what's ours." The tension in the square grew thicker, but it was a different kind of tension now, one laced with determination, with the kind of grit that only comes when people are forced to confront the reality of their situation. The murmurs grew louder, some voices raised in agreement, others skeptical, but Cole knew he was getting through. He could feel it in the air, like the first stirrings of a storm. One by one the men stepped forward, some with hesitation, others with fiery resolve. A rancher with a rough face and calloused hands shook Cole's hand firmly, the silent exchange of a promise. Then another and another, until the small group of townsfolk had become a gathering of nearly 24. The former soldier, the man who had spoken first, gave a curt nod. "I'm with you, McAllister," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've seen Aldrich's men in action. They fight dirty, but they don't have the stomach for a real fight. We take 'em by surprise, and we can run them out of here." Cole nodded, his heart stirring with a renewed sense of purpose. "We move fast. No one gets left behind." With that, the plan began to take shape. The group broke off into smaller units, each tasked with specific roles: gathering supplies, scouting Aldridge's known locations, and preparing weapons. The air hummed with a new energy, an energy fueled by the collective realization that they were no longer alone in this fight. They were a force that could stand up to Aldridge and the tyranny he'd tried to impose. The scene shifted, a montage of rough hands shaking in solidarity, eyes alight with renewed hope as the townsfolk gathered what they could. A couple of the ranchers went to retrieve extra rifles from their homes. Others gathered old ammunition, tools, and whatever food they could spare. The camaraderie was palpable, the sense of unity growing with every passing minute. Even the outcasts, those who had long since turned away from the establishment, stepped forward, joining in with quiet but firm resolve. Cole watched as the men and women of the town moved with purpose, their faces set in determination. There was no more doubt, no more fear. This was the beginning of something that could change everything, not just for them, but for the future of the land they had worked so hard to build. As he moved to gather his own things, he felt a deep, resonating pull within him. This was what he had been waiting for. This was what he had been called to do. No longer was he just a man with a promise. He was a man with a cause, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he believed they had a chance to take back their lives. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the square, but the light in the hearts of those gathered was just beginning to rise. "We ride at dawn," Cole said, his voice steady as he turned toward the group, the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders like a well-worn coat. "We take the first step toward reclaiming what's ours." As the group dispersed to gather their supplies, Cole stood for a moment, watching the horizon where the last light of day disappeared behind the distant hills. For the first time in a long while, he felt the spark of something fierce, something undeniable beginning to kindle within him. This was the moment, and nothing was going to stand in their way. The barn, once a simple shelter for animals and tools, had been transformed into a makeshift war room, its quiet space now filled with the hum of urgency. The warm light of lanterns flickered in the corners, casting shadows that danced over the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling. The scent of hay and wood mingled with the acrid tang of metal and gunpowder, the air thick with the heat of preparation. Cole stood at the center of the barn, his eyes scanning the scene around him. A map of the region had been hastily tacked to one of the walls, a patchwork of routes, landmarks, and Aldridge's known locations drawn in charcoal. The barn had become more than just a place of refuge. It was now a command center, a place where strategy would be birthed, and where they would prepare to take back what was theirs. The ragtag group of ranchers, former soldiers, and outcasts were scattered throughout the barn, moving in synchronized chaos. Some were testing weapons, the sharp snap of the rifle's action echoing through the space. Others were assembling provisions, pulling together food and water for the ride ahead. There was a palpable sense of camaraderie in the air, but also a heavy tension. Each man and woman knew the stakes. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a fight for their homes, their land, and their future. Lila moved quietly among them, her brow furrowed as she watched Cole give instructions to a few of the men. His posture was tense, shoulders rigid with the weight of responsibility, but his eyes were clear and determined. There was no hesitation in him now, not like there had been in the early days when the uncertainty of their situation had weighed him down. He had found his purpose, and in doing so he had found a strength that had been missing before. As the plans were laid out on the table, Cole motioned for the group to gather around, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "We ride at dawn. We hit Aldridge's camp under the cover of darkness, and we take him by surprise. We'll use the terrain to our advantage, moving fast and quiet. We can't afford to make a sound." The men nodded, their expressions serious, though there was a flicker of something in their eyes, a hope that had been buried for too long, now ignited by the possibility of victory. Lila stood near the edge of the group, her hands folded in front of her as she watched Cole. She knew he was doing everything he could to prepare, but she couldn't shake the feeling of worry that gnawed at her insides. The danger they faced was real, and as much as she trusted him, as much as she believed in the strength of the men he had gathered, her heart couldn't ignore the weight of what was at stake. As the group began to disperse, preparing for the ride ahead, Cole glanced over at her. His eyes met hers, and for a moment the noise of the barn seemed to fade away. The tension, the strategies, the uncertainty, all of it melted into the quiet understanding between them. She moved toward him, her steps light but purposeful, her eyes searching his face for something, some reassurance that, despite the odds, they would come through this. When she reached him, the noise of the barn returned, but it felt distant now, as though the two of them existed in a world all their own. "You'll be careful, won't you?" Lila's voice was soft, almost hesitant, as though she were afraid to break the fragile moment they had carved out of the chaos around them. Cole's jaw tightened, the weight of his promise to her still heavy on his shoulders. "I'll do whatever it takes, Lila. I won't let anything happen to you." But she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the unspoken worry that mirrored her own. She could feel the internal struggle in him between duty and something deeper, something that neither of them had fully allowed themselves to acknowledge. She placed a hand on his arm, steadying him, her touch soft but firm. "I know," she said, her voice low and steady. "I trust you, Cole. Just promise me that when this is over we'll find our way through this, together." Cole's eyes softened, and for a moment the world around them seemed to pause. The noise of the barn faded, and the only sound was the steady beat of their hearts. His hand covered hers, his grip warm and reassuring. "We'll get through this, Lila," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "When this is over, we'll figure everything out. I promise." The words hung between them, a quiet promise that neither of them fully understood, but both of them desperately needed, and in that moment there was nothing else. No doubt, no fear, only the bond they had forged in the quiet moments that had passed between them. It was a bond that had survived the storms of their lives, and it would survive this. As Lila pulled away, the weight of the promise still heavy between them, she nodded, her gaze lingering on his face for a moment longer before she turned to join the others. The moment was over, the reality of the battle ahead settling back in, but something had shifted. The quiet uncertainty in her heart had eased, replaced by a fragile hope, a hope that, no matter the outcome, they would find a way to survive this together. The men were now preparing to leave, gathering their gear, and Cole turned back to the group. He spoke briefly to the soldiers, making sure everything was in order before his gaze shifted back to the barn doors. The night was falling fast, the sky now a deep blue, and he knew the hours before dawn would pass too quickly. Outside the night was still, the sky clear except for the moon, which now hung high and heavy above them, casting its pale light over the land. It was a quiet night, too quiet for comfort, but there was a sense of unity in the air now, a sense of purpose that had been missing before. They weren't just fighting for the ranch anymore, they were fighting for each other. Cole stood at the edge of the barn, watching as his companions readied themselves. As the moon climbed higher, casting long shadows across the land, Cole felt a renewed sense of resolve settle within him. The time for doubt was over. This was their fight, and he was ready to lead them into it. As the group mounted their horses and began to ride out, Cole took one last look at the barn, the place that had become their base of operations. He knew that when this was all over, things would never be the same. But what mattered now was that they had a chance to take back what was rightfully theirs. The star-lit sky stretched endlessly above them as they rode, the air cool against their faces, the sound of hooves a steady rhythm in the night. And for the first time in weeks, Cole felt a spark of hope flicker deep inside him, a spark that would carry him through the darkness of the coming battle. They were united now, and no matter the outcome, he knew they would face it together. The night had fallen like a heavy, suffocating blanket, the air thick with the scent of earth and impending rain. The sky above was dark and starless, the moon hidden behind a veil of clouds, offering only faint shadows in the vast expanse of the frontier. The land around Aldridge's compound seemed to swallow them whole as Cole led his team through the underbrush, their movements swift and silent. The sprawling estate ahead loomed like a fortress, its walls high and foreboding, the flickering of torchlight casting an eerie glow across the darkened grounds. The compound sat at the edge of the frontier, a place of privilege and power, built to intimidate, to hold what it claimed with an iron fist. But tonight it would be the site of a reckoning. Tonight they would take it back. Cole's heart pounded as he moved through the shadows, his breath shallow but steady. Every step felt like a step closer to the edge of discovery. His eyes flicked between the trees, scanning for movement, for any sign of the sentries who patrolled the grounds. His team was close behind him, men and women all hardened by the violence of the world around them, but even they could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a raid. And it was as dangerous as it was necessary. "Quiet," Cole whispered, his voice barely audible, his eyes scanning the high stone wall that surrounded the estate. His hand gestured for them to crouch low, moving between the thick brush and shadows cast by the compound's high walls. The air was still, the only sound the rustle of leaves beneath their feet. Each step was measured, the slow scrape of boots against earth muffled by the dense foliage around them. Cole's eyes flicked over the top of the stone walls, taking in the faint outline of guards posted near the gate, their lanterns swinging with the wind, their movements deliberate. He knew the layout of the compound, had studied it meticulously in the days leading up to this moment. They'd have to move fast, strike when the guards' attention was diverted, and pray the booby traps set around the perimeter didn't claim them first. The team pressed forward, single file, their bodies low to the ground, their movements synchronized with a quiet precision that came from hours of training, of trust forged in the fire of desperation. They crossed the first open stretch of ground without incident, the rustling leaves of the wind their only cover. Then, as they neared the northern corner of the compound, the first obstacle appeared, a set of tripwires, thin and nearly invisible against the dark earth. Cole's hand shot out, signaling for the team to stop. His eyes narrowed, calculating, as he crouched low to examine the trap. The wire was taut, a subtle glint of metal catching the dim light. He moved swiftly, gently testing the wire with the tip of his boot, ensuring it didn't trigger the alarm. A sharp breath escaped him when it didn't snap. "Watch your steps," he murmured, guiding them through with careful precision. One by one, the team passed without triggering the trap, the tension building with each step. As they neared the compound's southern wall, another set of guards came into view, their figures flickering against the torchlight. Cole's breath hitched, but he kept his movements steady, his hand gesturing for the team to flatten against the earth, hidden by the thick brush and stone. A guard passed mere feet from them, his heavy boots crunching the gravel beneath him. The sound of his footsteps echoed in Cole's ears, a reminder of how easily they could be discovered. Every muscle in his body tensed as the guard halted, scanning the darkness, pausing just inches away from their hiding place. The air felt thick, like a shroud wrapped around them, suffocating them with the danger of discovery. A heartbeat later, the guard turned and continued his patrol, his lantern swinging in the wind. The team exhaled collectively, their bodies relaxing just slightly, but their minds remained sharp. "Move," Cole breathed, his voice low and commanding. They pressed on, keeping close to the walls, using every shadow, every patch of darkness to their advantage. They passed through another section of the compound undetected, moving toward the heart of the estate where Lila was being held. The air was thick with anticipation, the oppressive silence around them amplified by the beating of their own hearts. Each member of the team knew what was at stake. This wasn't just about the land. This was about Lila. About getting her out before Aldridge's men could hurt her, before they could solidify their hold on the land that belonged to her. The closer they got to the inner courtyard, the more dangerous it became. The traps were more sophisticated here, the patrols more frequent. Cole's gaze darted to the stone walls, then to the lanterns swaying in the wind. The estate seemed to breathe, alive with the threat of discovery. A faint metallic scent drifted through the air, the remnants of the traps set to catch anyone foolish enough to venture too close. A guard stepped into their path, his silhouette tall against the backdrop of the courtyard. Cole froze. His breath caught in his throat as he watched the man shift his weight and start to move forward. The team didn't make a sound, every muscle locked in a moment of desperate stillness. They were close. So close. A flash of movement, a shadow at the corner of his eye, and suddenly one of the men from the team lunged forward, the silent crack of a rifle shot ringing through the air. The guard crumpled without a sound, falling to the ground with barely a thud. "Move!" Cole barked, his voice commanding. The team moved swiftly, crossing the open courtyard to the back doors of the mansion. The sound of muffled footsteps echoed in the narrow hallways as they infiltrated the mansion's interior, the stillness of the night inside almost suffocating in its intensity. The air was thick with tension, and Cole's pulse quickened as he led them down shadowed hallways, the faint sound of Lila's voice, muffled, distant, reaching his ears. His heart raced. He was so close. Through narrow corridors, past rooms filled with dark furniture and ornate decor, they finally reached the basement where Lila was held. The heavy metal door creaked open, the darkness swallowing them whole. There, behind bars, was Lila, pale, exhausted, but alive. And in that moment, as Cole's eyes met hers, a wave of desperation and hope crashed over him. This was it! This was the moment they'd all been fighting for. The team stood behind him, breathless, watching as Cole slowly, carefully unlocked the door. The tension that had been building since the beginning of the night, the fear, the uncertainty, finally began to ebb away, replaced by a quiet certainty. They were going to make it. They had made it. As Lila's gaze locked with his, her face lighting up with a mixture of relief and disbelief, Cole felt a surge of emotion he couldn't contain. The nightmare was almost over. The mission was a success. But as he reached out to help her to her feet, the weight of the past few days, of the choices he had made, still clung to him like a heavy burden. And as he took her hand, the promise he had made to her and to himself suddenly felt real in a way it never had before. The air inside the compound was thick with the smell of old stone and stale wood, the dimly lit corridors cloaking their movements in darkness. The only sound was the soft scrape of boots on cold stone. The team moving silently, as though they were ghosts in the belly of the beast. Every breath seemed too loud, every shift of movement too much, but they couldn't afford hesitation. Not now. Not when they were so close. Cole led the way, his eyes flicking to every shadow, every flicker of light that might give away their presence. They were close. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. Lila was somewhere behind that door, behind that cold metal. He had promised to bring her out, and he would. Not just for the land, not just for the fight, but for her. He paused at the door to the cell, his hand on the cold iron of the handle. The team stood back in the shadows, their breath held, waiting for his signal. They had come this far, but this part of the mission was the most critical. One wrong move, one sound too loud, and everything would fall apart. He listened. His ear pressed to the door and heard the muffled sound of a guard shifting, the scrape of a boot on the floor. A moment later, he heard the low murmur of a voice. A guard talking to himself, or perhaps someone else. It didn't matter. Cole's eyes narrowed, his pulse quickened. This was it. "Stay close," Cole whispered, signaling to the others as he crouched down, his body moving like a shadow as he slipped into the corridor. He had no time to waste. The guard stationed outside the cell was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the unmistakable uniform of Aldridge's hired men. He stood near the door, his back to Cole. For a brief moment, the world seemed to slow, every second stretching before him as his eyes scanned the area. The guard's position was perfect, His attention distracted, his body relaxed, thinking he was safe. Cole moved swiftly, the weight of his body barely making a sound as he crept forward. His hand shot out, covering the guard's mouth and neck with a firm grip. The man's body jerked, startled, but Cole's strength was undeniable. He moved with swift, practiced precision, rendering the man unconscious in moments. The guard crumpled in Cole's arms, his body slumping to the floor without a sound. "Get him out of sight," Cole ordered quietly as he eased the unconscious body into the shadows. The others moved quickly, dragging the guard away, and Cole reached for the cell door. He paused for just a second, his breath catching in his throat. He was so close now. "Lila!" He twisted the handle, the metal creaking in protest as he pushed the door open just a fraction. The dim glow of a single lantern flickered in the cell, casting long shadows across the cold stone walls. And there she was, Lila, pale, bruised, but alive. She was sitting on the ground, her back against the wall, her head tilted slightly as she seemed to doze. The sight of her, of the woman he had come to love, made something inside him snap into place. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of relief and guilt filling every corner of his mind. "Lila," Cole whispered, his voice rough as he stepped inside, the door creaking slightly as it swung open. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment there was only the shock of recognition in her gaze. Her breath caught as she took in the sight of him, her face a mixture of disbelief, confusion, and something deeper, relief. "Cole!" Her voice was hoarse, raw, but her lips curled into the faintest smile. She started to rise, but her body faltered, the exhaustion and the ordeal weighing her down. She reached out for him, her arms trembling, and he was there in an instant, sweeping her into his arms as though she weighed nothing. The moment they touched felt like an eternity. The chaos of the world around them, the danger, the stakes, they all fell away. It was just him and her. For a heartbeat, the air between them was still, the reality of the rescue settling into the warmth of their embrace. "I'm sorry, Lila," he whispered, his voice tight with guilt. "I should have gotten here sooner." She shook her head, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw as she pulled back slightly to meet his gaze. "You came. That's all that matters now." There was no more time for words. There was no more room for anything but the urgency of their situation. Cole pulled away just enough to help her to her feet, his arm around her waist, his body supporting hers as they moved toward the door. "Let's go," Cole muttered, his voice urgent, filled with a sense of finality. "We're getting out of here." But as they made their way toward the exit, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. The team stiffened, and Cole's heart jumped into his throat. They were running out of time. "They know," Cole growled. "We've been made." The team moved quickly, urging Lila to follow closely behind. The door slammed shut behind them, and Cole led them through the darkened corridors with swift precision. His heart hammered in his chest, but his eyes never wavered from the task at hand. He had to get her out. They had to leave before it was too late. They moved through the compound, evading the guards as they went. Every turn felt like a gamble, every hallway a potential dead end. But Cole was focused, his mind working faster than his body could keep up, calculating every step, every possible risk. Just as they neared the main exit, the sound of shouting erupted behind them. The alarm had been raised. "At!" Cole barked as he pushed the door open with a force that rattled the frame. The team spilled out into the courtyard, the cold night air a sharp contrast to the warmth inside the compound. They were almost there. But as they reached the outer walls, the sound of hooves thundered in the distance. More guards, more of Aldrich's men. "Get on the horses!" Cole shouted, pulling Lila behind him. He was acutely aware of the time slipping away, the tension building in his chest. This was it. They were so close. The team scrambled, mounting their horses with urgency, the horses shifting restlessly beneath them. The escape was fraught with near misses, the sound of gunshots ringing through the night as they made their way through the open ground. The compound's walls loomed behind them, an ominous reminder of how narrowly they had escaped. With one last look back, Cole spurred his horse forward, pushing it into a gallop. The others followed, their horses thundering across the open plains as the moonlit sky stretched endlessly above them. The land was open now, but the danger was far from over. As they rode through the night, the tension peaked. Cole's heart was still racing, his mind still grappling with the weight of the night's actions. They had succeeded, for now, but they were far from safe. The horizon before them was a blur of shadows and dust as the team galloped into the unknown, the starlit sky above them a stark reminder that the fight was far from over. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the vast open plain. The earth, parched and cracked, stretched out endlessly before Cole McAllister and his band of allies, the golden light turning the grasses into waves of fire. The estate loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the fading sky, its imposing walls and towers a constant reminder of the tyranny that had taken hold of their land. The day's heat still clung to the air, but a cool breeze began to stir, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and the promise of a storm. The horses beneath them shifted restlessly, their hooves kicking up clouds of dirt as they trotted along the narrow trail, their riders tense and watchful. Cole's jaw was tight, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon, his mind raced with strategy, but beneath it all there was an undercurrent of raw emotion, the weight of everything that had brought them here. This wasn't just about the ranch anymore. This was about justice. The moment they had all been waiting for had arrived. Behind them, the sound of hooves grew louder, a rhythmic pounding that soon became the unmistakable clamor of men on horseback. Cole's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't flinch. He was ready. He had to be. The enemy was here. The first of Aldridge's men emerged from the dust, their horses thundering over the plain. At the front of the group, riding tall and proud, was Aldridge himself. His face was hard and cold, his eyes gleaming with ruthless ambition, as though the world existed solely for his taking. The sun cast a cruel light on his features, the smirk playing at the corners of his lips, barely concealing the contempt he felt for the group standing before him. Cole's breath caught in his throat as their eyes met. He had known this confrontation was inevitable, but now that it was here, the reality of it was like a lightning bolt in his chest. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Aldrich's voice rang out, cold and filled with arrogance. "I see you've gathered a motley crew, McAllister. It's almost laughable, really." He looked at the group with disdain, his men fanning out behind him, their guns resting casually at their sides. "You're wasting your time. The land is mine. You're too late." The words were meant to provoke, and they did. But Cole stood his ground, his hand on the hilt of his rifle, his body coiled with the tension of the moment. "It's not your land, Aldridge. It never was." "And I'm here to take it back?" Aldridge chuckled darkly, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed Cole and his allies. "You think you can stand against me? Against this?" He gestured to the men behind him, the well-armed, ruthless thugs who had done his bidding for far too long. "You're nothing, just like the rest of them. I will crush you, McAllister, and when I do, you'll wish you had never drawn your gun." A tense silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of history, of broken promises, of lives on the line. The air felt charged, like the stillness before a storm. And then, in the blink of an eye, the silence shattered with the sound of a single shot. The chaos exploded around them. Gunfire rang out in every direction as both sides took cover and returned fire. The crack of rifles, the blast of pistols. Each shot was a testament to the deadly stakes of the battle. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, sharp shadows over the field as the confrontation unfolded. Cole moved swiftly, his instinct sharp, his focus unyielding. He dove behind a large boulder, his rifle up and steady as he fired at Aldridge's men. His heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve was clear. This wasn't just about survival. It was about taking back what was theirs, and if Aldridge thought he could intimidate them into submission, he was sorely mistaken. "Keep moving!" Cole shouted to his men, his voice firm with authority. The band scattered, taking strategic positions behind rocks, trees, and the low brush of the plain. The plan was clear. Hit hard, hit fast, and never give Aldridge's men a chance to regroup. The battle raged on, the sounds of gunfire mixing with shouts of determination and anger. It was a war of wills. Cole's unwavering resolve against Aldridge's cold ambition. Every shot counted, every move was calculated. They were outnumbered, but they were fast. They were determined, and as the sun dipped further below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, Cole knew they were gaining ground. Aldridge's men were beginning to falter, their confidence slipping as they realized they weren't dealing with a group of helpless farmers. These were men fighting for their lives, for their families, and for their land. And then, as the last of Aldridge's men were dispatched or driven back, Cole's eyes fixed on the man who had been the source of their suffering, Aldridge himself. The Baron's smug expression had faded, replaced by a snarl of frustration. He drew his own pistol, his movements sharp and precise as he moved toward Cole. But Cole was already there, his rifle aimed squarely at Aldridge's chest. "You're done," Cole said, his voice steady, the words like a promise and a threat all at once. "This land doesn't belong to you." Aldridge sneered. "You think you've won? You're nothing but a fool, McAllister. This is my land. It always has been." "You're wrong," Cole replied, his voice a mixture of fury and relief. "It never was." The tension in the air was palpable, each breath heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The ground beneath them was littered with the remnants of the battle. Broken men, empty cartridges, and the heavy scent of gunpowder. The scales of justice had tipped, and it was clear who had come out on top. The dust of the battle still lingered in the air, thick and heavy, as Cole stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Aldridge, who now knelt before him, his hands bound by his own men's ropes. The man's arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by the bitter taste of defeat. He had thought he could take everything, take the land, take the people, take the very soul of the frontier. But in the end it was his own greed that had been his undoing. Cole approached him slowly, his boots crunching against the earth as he stood before the defeated Baron. Aldridge's eyes glinted with malice, but they lacked the power they once held. "You should have stayed out of this, McAllister." Aldridge spat, his voice laced with venom. You think you've won? You've only delayed the inevitable." Cole's eyes narrowed as he looked down at the man who had caused so much pain. His grip on his rifle tightened, but his voice remained steady, filled with quiet authority. "The inevitable? No, Aldridge, you are finished. The land belongs to the people who work it, not to a tyrant who seeks to control it." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, as the sound of distant riders drew closer, Aldridge's remaining men retreating in defeat. "It's over," Cole said, the finality of it in his voice. "Your reign ends here." With that he turned his back on Aldridge, walking toward his men, the weight of the battle lifting from his shoulders. The land, the people, and their future were finally theirs again. The sky had darkened completely now, the first stars twinkling in the vast expanse above them. The battle had been fought, and the victory was sweet, but there was still much to be done. As Cole walked back toward the rest of his team, his eyes caught sight of Lila, her figure standing at the edge of the battlefield, her gaze fixed on him. Her face was tired but relieved, her eyes shining with a warmth that made his heart stir. They had done it. They had won. The moon rose high above, its pale light bathing the land in a soft glow, a symbol of the peace they had reclaimed. And as Cole stood there, his allies gathering around him, he knew that this was just the beginning. They had fought for their future, and now it was time to build it. Together. The early morning sky was a soft tapestry of peach and lavender, the first light of dawn spilling gently over the ranch. The fields, still kissed by dew, stretched out before the modest farmhouse, a serene landscape that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the past days. The world seemed to breathe deeply, the steady rustle of wind in the trees and the distant chirp of birds, the only sounds breaking the stillness of the dawn. Inside the farmhouse, the scent of lavender and healing herbs mingled in the warm air. Lila lay on a bed of fresh linens in the quiet room, her face pale but her expression softer now. free from the terror that had gripped her since the night of her captivity. The bruises on her arms were still fresh, the gash on her side healing under the careful ministrations of the local healer, an elderly woman who had come to tend to her injuries with expert hand. Cole sat beside the bed, his posture stiff, his gaze never straying far from Leela's face. He hadn't left her side since they had returned to the ranch. The hours had passed in a haze of worry, the weight of everything he had put her through pressing on him with an intensity that made his chest ache. He had sworn to protect her, yet there she lay, battered and bruised from the ordeal. His heart ached with the knowledge that, despite his efforts, he had failed her in so many ways. As the healer worked, Cole remained silent, his eyes tracing the lines of Lila's face, watching the way her breath seemed to settle a little deeper with each passing moment. She had been so strong, so resilient, but he knew the trauma of her experience was more than just physical. It had shaken her, as it had shaken him. She had trusted him, and yet in the darkest moment he had been unable to prevent the pain she had suffered. Leela's voice, soft but steady, broke the silence. "Cole," she said, her eyes meeting his, though her voice carried a hint of weariness, "you don't have to sit here. You've done enough. Go get some rest. I'll be fine." But Cole only shook his head, his hand moving to gently rest on hers. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly, his voice hoarse, like it carried more than just fatigue. "Not until you're fully recovered." Lila managed a faint smile, though it was tempered by something deep within her, something he could see but couldn't quite name. She turned her head slightly, her eyes turning inward as though lost in thought. "I don't know how to thank you, Cole." "For everything." "You don't need to thank me," Cole replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I made a promise, Lila. I should have kept it. I should have gotten to you sooner." Lila's eyes softened as she squeezed his hand gently. "You did what you could. We both did. And you brought me back. That's all that matters now." But Cole's brow furrowed, the self-reproach still hanging heavy in the air between them. "I still feel like I failed you. If I had been faster, if I had—" Lila shook her head, silencing him with a quiet strength that caught him off guard. "Cool," she said, her voice steady. "This wasn't just about you. You fought for me, for this ranch, for everyone who has been oppressed by Aldrich and his men. But I'm not some helpless woman. I know you feel responsible, but I don't want you to carry that weight alone. It's not yours to bear." Her words, so simple yet so powerful, struck him harder than anything else. He had always carried his burden alone, always felt the weight of promises and oaths pressing down on him. But here was Lila, telling him that it was okay to let go, to share the load. "Lila," Cole murmured, his voice breaking as he looked down at her, the depth of his feelings stirring within him. "You mean more to me than anything in this world, more than this land, more than any promise I've made. And I want you to know that, no matter what, I'm not going anywhere. This vow I made to you, it's not just about keeping you safe anymore. It's about us. I want a future with you. If you'll have me—" Lila's eyes filled with something warm, something tender, and she reached out, her hand finding his cheek, her touch soft and steady, like the touch of a woman who had lived through the worst and still had the courage to hope. "I've never been good at trusting people," Lila said quietly, her voice filled with vulnerability. "Not after everything I've lost. But with you, Cole, with you I feel like maybe I can learn to trust again. Maybe I can let myself believe in something, in us." The quiet admission made Cole's heart swell. He leaned in slightly, his forehead resting gently against hers. His breath was warm against her skin, and for a moment everything else faded away. The world outside, the weight of the past, even the healer who continued her work. There was only the two of them, the promise that lingered between them, and the faint whisper of hope that this broken world could be mended. "I won't let you down," Cole promised, his voice rough but filled with determination. "I won't break this promise. Not ever again. Lila's eyes searched his, as though looking for something, perhaps for the truth in his words, perhaps for the certainty that had been missing from her life for so long. But then, as if she found what she was seeking, she nodded, a small, relieved smile curling on her lips. And in that moment, Cole knew that this wasn't just about keeping a promise. It wasn't just about duty. It was about love. The love that had always been there, buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to surface. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten, the soft blush of dawn breaking over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the land. The ranch, the place where so much had been lost, now stood as a symbol of renewal, a place where healing was not just possible, but inevitable. As the sun crested the horizon, bathing the world in its soft golden light, Cole and Lila held each other in the quiet sanctuary of that moment. The healing had begun, of their bodies, of their hearts, and in the promise of the new day they found the strength to move forward, together. The ranch had been saved, their lives restored, and in the quiet dawn a new chapter had begun. The morning sun rose slowly, casting a warm, golden light over the ranch that had once been the heart of Cole McAllister's world. It now stood as a symbol of both loss and rebirth. The past days had been filled with relief and exhaustion, the battle for the land won. But the real work was just beginning. The fields, once lush with crops, had fallen into disrepair under Aldridge's tyranny. The barns were damaged, fences sagging under neglect, and the house itself had felt empty for far too long. But now the land seemed to breathe again. The air was crisp with the smell of fresh earth, and the soft hum of activity filled the ranch. Neighbors and allies, men and women who had once been wary of the struggle, who had quietly witnessed the injustice but kept their distance, had come in force to help. They moved through the fields, lifting broken beams, hammering nails, and working together as if the very act of rebuilding was a reclamation of something more than just land, was a reclaiming of community, of spirit, of hope. Lila stood at the edge of the fields, her hands resting on her hips as she surveyed the progress. The workers, some of them her neighbors, others Cole's allies, worked in harmony, their laughter ringing out in the cool morning air. It felt good to hear the sound, a reminder of the days before all the hardship, when the ranch had been filled with the quiet joy of a family at work. It had been so long since it had felt that way, but today it was different. Today, the rhythm of life was returning to the ranch, one nail at a time, one fence post at a time. "Here, let me help you with that," Cole said, his voice warm with affection as he approached her. He reached for the large wooden beam she was attempting to carry and lifted it easily, his muscles straining, but the effort hardly noticeable to him. Lila gave him a small smile, the smile that had been rare in recent months, but was slowly becoming more frequent now. "I can manage it," she protested, though she didn't pull away from him. Instead, she let him carry the weight, the quiet intimacy of the moment making her heart beat just a little faster. Their bond had been tested in ways she never imagined, and while the scars of the past would never fully fade, there was a sense of peace that was settling between them now, a quiet understanding. They had come through the worst of it, and somehow, together, they would rebuild. "I know you can," Cole said softly, his voice just for her. He glanced at her, his eyes filled with the quiet admiration that always seemed to make her heart swell. "But you've done enough already. Let me carry the weight this time." Lila nodded, her throat tightening with something she couldn't name. She had never been one to ask for help, never been one to accept it without hesitation. But with Cole it felt different. It always had. He had proven himself to her in ways both large and small, and now there was room for both of them to heal. As they moved forward together, their hands brushing for a fleeting moment, Lila couldn't help but think of all they had been through, the pain, the fear, the loss, but also the victories, The small moments of tenderness, the quiet strength of their shared love. They were rebuilding the ranch, yes, but they were also rebuilding themselves in ways that were both painful and beautiful. The laughter of the others carried through the air as more workers arrived. Neighbors, some of whom had been just as wounded by Aldrich's reign, came to lend their hands. There was something so healing about the work, the shared labor. The sound of hammers, the scent of fresh cut wood, the rhythm of people working together. It was a melody that soothed something deep inside her, something she had almost forgotten. Leela stepped aside as a group of children ran by, their laughter pure and unburdened as they helped move small tools and carry water to the workers. Her heart swelled at the sight of them. These were the children who had watched their parents suffer under Aldrich's rule, children who had learned early on what it meant to fight for what was theirs. And now here they were, growing up in a place where justice had been served and hope was being restored. "You're not getting out of this that easily," Cole said with a teasing grin as he motioned for her to come back to the work at hand. He was standing next to a partially rebuilt fence, the sturdy posts now in place but needing a final layer of repair. "There's still plenty of work to do. I'm not letting you slack off just because I'm around." Leela laughed softly, shaking her head as she approached him. I think I've earned a break," she teased, though there was a playful glint in her eye. "But if you insist." The day passed in a blur of activity. There was no sense of rush, no urgency to get everything finished in one go. It was a slow, steady restoration, piece by piece. The workers, their hands calloused and their faces sun-kissed, moved with an easy camaraderie, working alongside the McAllisters as if they had always been a part of this land. As the sun began to dip low, casting long, golden rays across the ranch, Cole and Lila stood together near the freshly rebuilt barn. They had finished for the day, and the work had left them both exhausted but fulfilled in ways they hadn't expected. Cole's arm was around her shoulders, his touch warm and reassuring as they watched the horizon. "I don't know how you managed to hold everything together, Lila," Cole said, his voice filled with awe and something deeper, something reverent. "You've been through so much, and yet here you are, so strong, so unbroken." Lila turned to face him, her heart swelling with the emotion in his words. She knew he meant it, but what he didn't understand was that it wasn't just her strength. It was his too. His presence, his determination, had been a steady anchor through the storm. They had been each other's strength, and together they were healing. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said softly, her fingers brushing his chest, where his heart beat just beneath the worn fabric of his shirt. "I couldn't have rebuilt it all, us, without you." They stood there, silent for a moment, watching as the last light of day disappeared below the horizon. The land before them, the ranch, had been through so much, but now it was finally beginning to heal. The scars of the past would always remain, but in the golden light of dusk there was hope, there was promise. The moon rose in the sky, casting a soft glow over the land as Cole and Lila stood together, their hands entwined, watching as the world around them breathed a little easier. The journey had been long, but the future was finally within reach, and as the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, a quiet optimism settled between them. A promise of renewal, a promise of love, a promise of a life rebuilt. Together. The ranch was alive with the hum of activity as the morning sun climbed higher into the sky, bathing the fields in golden light. The land, once scarred and neglected, now thrived beneath Cole and Lila's steady hands. The crops flourished in neat rows, the fields lush with green. The barns had been repaired, their timbers strong and solid. The house, once a shadow of its former self, now stood proud, its windows gleaming with warmth and promise. Cole and Leela walked the property together, their boots crunching on the dirt path as they moved through the land they had worked so hard to restore. The bond between them had deepened over the months since Aldrich's defeat, forged through shared labor and quiet moments of understanding. They had come through the darkness, and now the future stretched before them, vibrant and full of possibility. Lila's hand rested gently in Cole's, her fingers intertwined with his in a simple gesture that spoke volumes of the trust they had built. She looked up at him, her eyes soft but filled with a quiet strength. The weight of everything they had been through, the pain, the uncertainty, had not broken them. It had only made their love more resilient, more steadfast. "This place," Lila said, her voice thick with emotion as she glanced around at the fields and the house, "it's more than just a ranch now, it's ours. We've made it ours together." Cole squeezed her hand, a smile tugging at his lips as he gazed at the land. "You've done more than that, Lila. You've made it flourish." He looked down at her, his eyes full of admiration. "We could never have done it without you." Lila's smile softened as she looked at him, her heart full of affection. "We've both put our hearts into it. We've both learned what this land means, what it takes to nurture it, to protect it." She stopped walking for a moment, turning to face him fully. "And we've both learned something else, haven't we?" Cole paused, his brow furrowing slightly as he met her gaze. "What's that?" Lila's voice dropped to a whisper, but it was filled with warmth. "That love, even when it's tested, can grow stronger. Even when it feels impossible, it can be worth fighting for." Her smile grew, a spark of something soft and tender dancing in her eye. "You've shown me that, Cole. That love isn't just about promises or duty, it's about trust. It's about choosing each other every day." A wave of tenderness swept over Cole, and he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I've learned the same thing, Lila. I've learned that duty doesn't have to come at the expense of love. I promised you I'd protect this place, protect you. But what I didn't realize was that I was building something with you. Something real, something I can't walk away from." Lila's heart swelled at his words, her eyes misting with the emotions she had long kept hidden. They had both suffered, both carried burdens that felt too heavy at times. But here, in the quiet of the morning, she could finally feel the weight of those struggles easing. The past could never be erased, but it was no longer the driving force of their lives. They had learned the power of patience, of resilience, and— "I never thought I could trust someone again," Lila said softly. "But you've shown me that it's possible to heal. You've shown me that trust isn't just something you give, it's something you earn, together." Cole's eyes softened with emotion, his heart swelling at her words. He cupped her face gently in his hands, his voice hushed but full of sincerity. "I'll never stop earning that trust, Lila. Not as long as I have breath in my lungs. We're in this together. I promise you that." A breeze stirred the air around them, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees, and the soft murmur of the workers in the distance filled the silence between them. There was an undeniable sense of peace in the moment, a sense that everything had finally come full circle. The past had been difficult, yes, but it had brought them here. Together, stronger than ever. Lila rested her head against Cole's chest, her heart beating in time with his. "I think we're ready for the next chapter," she said softly, her voice warm with the certainty that had taken root in her soul. "Whatever it brings." Cole kissed the top of her head, holding her close as they stood in the heart of the land they had fought to protect. The sun hung high, the sky a brilliant canvas of blue, and for the first time in a long time, Cole felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. "I'm ready too," he murmured, "and I'll be by your side for whatever comes next." The day of the community gathering arrived, with a clear, crisp sky overhead. The ranch had never looked more beautiful. The fields, now flourishing under the hard work of Cole and Lila and their neighbours, were a testament to their resilience. The house, the barn, the land, everything was thriving, just as they were. A long table was set up outside, covered with bright linens and surrounded by chairs. The scent of freshly baked bread and roasted meats wafted through the air, carried by the soft breeze. Neighbors and friends had gathered, their faces alight with laughter and joy, celebrating not just the revival of the ranch, but the unity and spirit that had carried them through the hardest times. Leela stood at the edge of the gathering, watching the faces of the people she had come to trust, the people who had stood beside her through everything. She felt a sense of peace, of accomplishment, that filled her heart to the brim. This was the beginning of something new, not just for the ranch, but for her, for Cole, and for the community they had helped to rebuild. Cole walked up beside her, his hand slipping into hers. "I never thought I'd see a day like this," he said, his voice soft, filled with awe as he took in the sight of the gathered crowd. Leela smiled, her gaze lingering on the scene before them. "I didn't either. But we've made it happen." Together, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long golden rays over the land, Cole and Lila stepped to the center of the gathering. The voices hushed, the crowd turning to face them. The moment felt almost sacred, like a promise being made not just to each other, but to the future. "We stand here today," Cole began, his voice steady, "because we know that love and duty can walk hand in hand. And we're grateful for the trust you've placed in us, to protect this land, to restore it, and to build something better for all of us." Lila squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. She knew what this moment meant. It wasn't just a celebration of what they had done, but a promise to continue building together. "And this," Lila said softly, "this is just the beginning of a new chapter. For us, for this ranch, and for the people who make it what it." The crowd erupted into applause, a collective cheer that rang through the air, carried on the wind that whispered through the trees. And as Cole and Lila stood there, hand in hand, watching the community that had supported them so fiercely, they knew this was only the first step. Their love, once fraught with uncertainty, had been tested and proven. And now, with the sun setting behind them, they looked toward a future full of endless possibilities. The horizon stretched before them, the vast open land a reminder of the freedom they had fought for, the hope they had reclaimed. And as the last light of day faded into night, the promise of renewal, of a new beginning, burned brightly in their hearts. The camera of the narrative panned out over the ranch, the fields now filled with the enduring spirit of the West, and the endless frontier stretched out before them, a symbol of the enduring spirit of the West. The story had come full circle, and the future, like the land before them, was wide open, waiting to be shaped by the strength of their love, their commitment, and their undying hope.